Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Have you ever wondered how a boy born into one of Rome's most powerful families could grow up surrounded by marble, ceremony, and privilege, and yet leave behind a name that would echo through history as both ruler and ruin? Tonight, we step into a world of polished stone courtyards, hushed political bargains, and the steady rhythm of Roman life at its height. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, I would love to know where you are listening from and what your local time is. It is always fascinating to imagine this quiet hour stretching across different cities and countries. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born in the year 37 AD, during a period when Rome appeared stable from the outside. The empire stretched from Britain's damp frontiers to the deserts of Syria. Grain ships crossed the Mediterranean with dependable rhythm. Soldiers guarded roads paved in stone. Senators wore white togas edged with purple, and debated matters of tax and law beneath painted ceilings. Yet the calm surface concealed tension. Power in Rome did not rest securely in institutions. It flowed through families. Lucius was born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a web of bloodlines tied to Augustus, the first emperor. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, came from a respected but not universally admired line. Ancient writers would later describe him as harsh and unpredictable. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, carried far greater weight. She was the sister of Emperor Caligula and the great-granddaughter of Augustus. Her childhood had been marked by exile, execution of relatives, and sudden reversals of fortune. She understood early that survival in Rome required vigilance. The child's earliest days passed inside noble houses where slaves moved quietly across mosaic floors. Roman infants of high rank were surrounded not only by parents but by nurses, attendants, and tutors assigned almost from birth. A wet nurse might hold him more often than his mother. Household gods stood in small shrines near the atrium, their bronze figures polished daily. Visitors would pause before them, offering brief prayers for protection. When Lucius was 2 years old, the Emperor Caligula, his uncle, was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard. The event shook the capital. Rome had grown accustomed to imperial authority, but the idea that a ruler could fall so suddenly unsettled everyone. Agrippina, as Caligula's sister, became vulnerable. Political winds shifted quickly. Within months, she was accused of conspiracy and sent into exile. For a young child, exile meant separation from comfort and familiarity. Agrippina was banished to the Pontine Islands, a quiet and rocky place off the Italian coast. Lucius remained in Rome for a time under the care of relatives. The absence of his mother during formative years left a quiet mark. In Roman culture, maternal influence was significant, especially among elite families where mothers often managed alliances and social networks. The boy learned early that proximity to power could change without warning. His father died when Lucius was around 3 years old. The circumstances were not dramatic, simply another example of how quickly life in the ancient world could end. Illness was common even in wealthy households. With his father gone and his mother in exile, Lucius became a child of shifting guardianship. Property, inheritance, and political connections were discussed around him in adult tones he could not yet understand. In 41 AD, another transformation arrived. After Caligula's death, his uncle Claudius was declared emperor. Claudius was older, scholarly, and underestimated by many senators. One of his early acts was to recall Agrippina from exile. She returned to Rome with measured composure. Her years away had sharpened her sense of caution. Lucius, now a small boy, was reunited with his mother in a city that seemed unchanged on the surface. Markets still sold olives and figs. Bakers shaped round loaves stamped with markings to identify their producers. Senators attended meetings in the Curia. Yet within the imperial family, alliances were quietly being redrawn. Agrippina remarried. Her new husband, Gaius Sallustius Crispus Pacinus, was wealthy and well-connected. Marriage in Rome among the elite was rarely sentimental. It served strategy. Through this union, Lucius regained financial stability. He was educated according to the expectations of his class. Tutors taught him reading, rhetoric, and the foundations of Roman law. Greek literature formed a significant part of his studies. Boys of noble birth learned Homer not simply for poetry, but for lessons in honor and fate. Roman education emphasized discipline. Boys rose early. They practiced memorization. They were corrected sharply for errors in pronunciation. Physical training accompanied intellectual work. The ideal Roman nobleman combined cultivated speech with bodily strength. As Lucius grew, he would have observed daily life in the capital with growing awareness. Rome in the mid-1st century was crowded and noisy. Multi-story apartment buildings housed common families in tight quarters. Wealthy households contrasted sharply with these insulae, offering courtyards, fountains, and painted walls depicting mythological scenes. Public baths provided social gathering spaces for all classes. News spread quickly through rumour in marketplaces and along the forum. Agrippina maintained careful watch over her son's development. She understood that blood alone did not secure advancement. Reputation mattered, connections mattered, timing mattered most of all. Claudius, the emperor, had his own son, Britannicus. As long as Britannicus lived, Lucius stood behind him in the line of succession. Yet imperial succession in Rome was not fully codified. Adoption could alter destiny. Augustus himself had adopted heirs to secure continuity. Agrippina recognized opportunity where others saw limitation. Over time, she moved closer to the center of power. In 49 AD, she married Emperor Claudius. The marriage was controversial. She was his niece, and Roman law required adjustment to allow it. But the Senate complied. Stability of the dynasty was considered paramount. Lucius, now about 12 years old, found himself living within the imperial household. Marble corridors and guarded entrances became part of his daily surroundings. Servants announced visitors. Military officers in polished armor stood at attention. The boy's status changed quietly but completely. In 50 AD, Claudius adopted Lucius and gave him a new name, Nero, Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. Adoption in Rome carried full legal weight. Nero now outranked Britannicus in age and prominence. The public began to see him as a likely successor. From that point forward, Nero's childhood ended in one sense. Expectations replaced ordinary growth. He was no longer simply a noble youth. He was a possible emperor. The city watched. Senators observed his manners. The Praetorian Guard evaluated his bearing. Agrippina ensured that he received guidance from respected figures. Among them was the philosopher Seneca. Seneca believed in moderation and self-control. His teachings emphasized reason over impulse. For a boy surrounded by luxury, such lessons were intended as balance. Nero showed early interest in music and performance. While Roman aristocrats valued culture, public performance by a man of high rank was usually restrained. It was acceptable to appreciate art, less so to seek applause. This subtle distinction would matter later. For now, the household remained outwardly harmonious. Claudius governed with steady, if sometimes cautious, administration. Grain supplies were secured, roads were maintained. Conquests in Britain extended Rome's reach. The empire functioned through layers of bureaucracy that kept daily life predictable. Nero moved through these years absorbing impressions. The rustle of togas in Senate chambers, the sound of water flowing in aqueduct-fed fountains, the scent of incense in household shrines. He observed how adults measured their words in the presence of power. By his mid-teens, Nero was engaged to Claudius's daughter Octavia. Marriage alliances reinforced legitimacy. The ceremony bound him more firmly to the imperial line. Beneath formal celebrations, however, tensions existed. Agrippina's influence over Claudius was widely discussed. Some admired her intelligence, others feared her ambition. Nero, still young, stood at the center of these conversations without fully shaping them. The year 54 AD approached with quiet uncertainty. Claudius was aging, his health declined gradually. Within palace walls, succession became less theoretical. Nero was 17. When Claudius died in October of that year, the transition moved swiftly. The Praetorian Guard declared Nero emperor before news spread widely. Senators confirmed the decision. Britannicus remained alive but sidelined. The boy who had once been separated from his mother and shuffled between guardians now found himself master of the Roman world. He was not yet 18. Rome, accustomed to rapid change within the ruling family, adjusted with outward calm. Shops opened the next morning. Bakers kneaded dough. Soldiers stood watch at city gates. Yet beneath routine, anticipation stirred. A young emperor can be shaped by those around him. At the beginning of Nero's reign, power rested not solely in his hands but in the shared influence of Agrippina, Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. For the moment, hope outweighed fear. The streets of Rome did not yet associate his name with fire or excess. They saw a youthful figure, promising generosity, and public games. They saw the continuation of a dynasty that had governed for decades. Nero himself, standing at the threshold of adulthood, carried private impressions, memories of exile stories told by his mother, lessons recited under careful tutors, the steady gaze of soldiers evaluating his composure. The empire he inherited was vast and structured, yet its stability depended on human decisions made daily. And so, without fanfare, the boy Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus became Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Nero's first days as emperor unfolded with careful precision. The city expected stability, and stability required performance of tradition. He appeared before the Senate, offering respect for their authority, and promising to govern in consultation rather than command. His voice, trained by years of rhetorical instruction, carried clearly through the chamber. Observers noted his composure. He was young, but he did not appear uncertain. Behind these formal gestures stood Agrippina. For years she had navigated court politics, endured exile, rebuilt alliances, and secured her son's adoption. Now she moved through the palace with quiet assurance. She received delegations, reviewed correspondence, and remained present in discussions where imperial decisions were shaped. Coins were minted that displayed her image alongside Nero's, a visible sign of influence rarely granted to women in Rome. Nero did not resist this arrangement at first. He had grown accustomed to her steady involvement. She had protected his position and arranged his education. In private hours, when official duties were complete, he returned to familiar habits, reading Greek texts, practicing music, and speaking with Seneca about questions of leadership and restraint. The capital during these early months experienced a sense of renewal. Public games were announced. Financial penalties imposed during Claudius's reign were reconsidered. Nero reduced certain taxes and presented himself as generous. The population of Rome valued tangible gestures. Grain supply remained steady, entertainment was frequent, and the emperor appeared approachable. Daily life in Rome continued with its layered rhythms. In the Subura district, shopkeepers arranged goods at dawn. In wealthier quarters, household slaves prepared morning meals of bread, olives, cheese, and diluted wine. Senators attended sessions beneath the watchful gaze of statues honoring Augustus and other predecessors. The Praetorian Guard maintained quiet vigilance around the imperial residence. Within the palace, Nero's education did not end with Accession. Seneca remained a guiding presence, offering advice grounded in Stoic philosophy. Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, managed military matters with efficiency. Together, they formed a protective circle around the young emperor, tempering decisions and ensuring continuity. Agrippina observed this dynamic with interest. Her authority had been strongest when Nero was heir. As emperor, he began to experience independence. Invitations to private gatherings arrived addressed to him alone. Senators sought his opinion directly. The subtle shift altered the atmosphere within the household. Nero's marriage to Octavia proceeded as planned. The ceremony reinforced dynastic unity. Octavia, quiet and dignified, embodied traditional virtues expected of imperial wives. Public celebrations accompanied the union. Citizens saw in the marriage a sign of continuity, yet Nero's interests extended beyond ceremonial duty. He found increasing satisfaction in artistic practice. Evenings were sometimes spent rehearsing musical compositions. The sound of the cithara echoed softly in private chambers. For Nero, Performance offered a form of clarity distinct from political calculation. Applause, even from a small audience of trusted companions, felt direct and uncomplicated. Agrippina viewed these pursuits with caution. She understood Roman expectations. Emperors were to command armies, administer justice, and uphold tradition. Public artistry risked diminishing authority. Tension developed not through open confrontation but through differing priorities. Meanwhile, the empire required attention beyond Rome. Reports arrived from Britain, where Roman forces consolidated control. In the eastern provinces, diplomacy with Parthia demanded careful negotiation. Nero relied heavily on experienced advisors to manage these matters. His youth made delegation necessary. As months passed, Nero grew more confident in public settings. He presided over games in the Circus Maximus, acknowledging cheers from the crowd. He addressed petitions brought by citizens seeking justice. The image of a benevolent young ruler took shape. Agrippina, accustomed to decisive influence, found herself gradually displaced from certain discussions. Invitations to council meetings were sometimes limited. Correspondence bypassed her oversight. She remained powerful but sensed change. The shift was not abrupt. It unfolded in small adjustments. Nero began to cultivate friendships independent of his mother's guidance. Among these were companions who shared his appreciation for art and leisure. Gatherings in gardens overlooking the city offered respite from official routine. Rome itself responded with mixed curiosity. The populace enjoyed spectacles and appreciated generosity. At the same time, senators monitored behavior closely. They valued stability and tradition. Nero's enthusiasm for performance remained largely private during these years, but rumors circulated. In daily administration, the early reign was measured. Judicial reforms aimed to reduce corruption among provincial governors. Financial accounts were reviewed. Public works continued. For ordinary citizens, life did not feel unstable. Bread remained affordable. Festivals occurred as scheduled. Within the palace, however, subtle competition for influence persisted. Agrippina's experience and determination had secured Nero's position. She expected continued partnership. Nero, approaching adulthood, sought personal authority. One incident illustrated the evolving dynamic. A delegation from Armenia arrived to discuss regional matters. Agrippina appeared at a meeting intending to sit beside Nero, symbolizing shared power. Burrus quietly suggested that tradition required the emperor alone to receive foreign envoys. Nero allowed the arrangement to proceed without his mother's presence. The decision signaled independence without confrontation. Agrippina adjusted her strategy. She reinforced connections with supporters in the Senate. She maintained relationships with military officers. Influence in Rome was rarely static. Nero, meanwhile, explored the balance between responsibility and personal inclination. His tutors continued to emphasize moderation. Seneca encouraged him to consider long-term consequences of each action. Burrus advised on maintaining loyalty among troops. In the streets below the Palatine, life carried forward with practical concerns. Traders negotiated prices. Artisans repaired sandals and crafted metal tools. Public baths filled with conversation about imperial generosity and upcoming games. Nero's youth made him a subject of fascination more than fear. As the second year of his reign unfolded, the separation between mother and son became more visible. Nero spent more evenings away from Agrippina's company. Decisions were increasingly announced as his own. Agrippina's image gradually disappeared from coinage. Yet, open hostility had not emerged. Their relationship reflected a transition familiar in many households, though magnified by imperial stakes. A son stepping into adulthood, a mother adjusting to diminished control. Beyond the palace, challenges gathered slowly. Provincial administration required vigilance. Political alliances demanded attention. Nero learned that the role of emperor involved constant judgment. In private reflection, he may have considered the path that had brought him here. Exile through his mother's misfortune, adoption through her strategy, accession through swift action. His identity was inseparable from hers, yet his reign would ultimately be measured as his own. The early promise of moderation remained intact. Rome functioned, senators cooperated. The Praetorian Guard stood loyal. Nero, still not 20, stood at a threshold between guidance and autonomy. The world around him appeared orderly, but its stability depended on choices that would gradually reshape his relationships and reputation. Adoption and transformation. The third year of Nero's reign did not begin with crisis. It began with routine. Petitions arrived at dawn. Couriers from distant provinces waited in shaded corridors. Accountants reviewed tax registers copied carefully onto wax tablets. The empire, vast and layered, depended on such ordinary motions more than on spectacle. Nero had now passed from adolescence into early adulthood. The ceremonies of accession were behind him. The first excitement of youth on the throne had settled into expectation. Rome no longer looked at him with curiosity alone. It began to measure him. Adoption had changed his name years earlier, but the meaning of that transformation continued to unfold. When Claudius had formally adopted him, the act had done more than adjust legal status. It had reshaped memory. Nero was no longer simply Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, son of Agrippina. He had been folded into the Claudian line, given ancestral titles that linked him to military victories and imperial administration. With that shift came responsibility to embody continuity. In public ceremonies, he now carried himself with more assurance. His posture was studied, but no longer tentative. He addressed senators without consulting written notes as frequently as before. The rhythm of governance became familiar. He listened to legal disputes. He approved funding for repairs to aqueducts. He authorized grain distributions when shipments were delayed by weather. Seneca remained near him during these years, not as a visible commander of policy, but as a voice in quieter hours. The philosopher encouraged restraint in punishment and fairness in taxation. Nero's early decrees reflected this influence. He spoke of clemency as strength rather than weakness. The Senate responded favorably. Yet adoption and transformation did not occur only in law or language. They unfolded within Nero himself. He had grown up conscious of his mother's vigilance, of the fragile position they once held. Now, surrounded by attendants who deferred at every gesture, he began to feel the distance between memory and present power. Agrippina observed this internal change. She had guided him through uncertainty, but she sensed that his dependence was fading. He consulted her less frequently. Decisions reached her after they were finalized. Their conversations shifted from strategy to formality. Outside the palace, Rome lived as it always had. In the forum, litigants argued cases before magistrates. Vendors sold garum in clay jars. Artisans hammered bronze into tools and decorative pieces. The Tiber carried barges loaded with grain upriver toward the city's storehouses. For most citizens, Nero's transformation from heir to emperor had not altered the price of bread or the pace of work. In the amphitheatre, preparations were underway for public games announced months earlier. Nero had approved generous funding for the spectacle. Gladiators trained in courtyards behind high walls. Animal handlers prepared exotic creatures imported from Africa. The people anticipated entertainment as reassurance that the emperor remained attentive. Within the imperial residence, Nero's interests continued to broaden. His practice of music became more disciplined. He studied technique carefully, not content with casual skill. In private gatherings, he performed before a small audience of trusted companions. Applause from them carried a different tone than applause from the crowd. It was controlled, intimate, and affirming. Roman aristocratic culture tolerated refined appreciation of the arts, but it valued moderation. Senators remembered Augustus, who had patronized poets yet maintained dignity. Nero's enthusiasm for performance existed in tension with these expectations, though it had not yet crossed public boundaries. His marriage to Octavia remained politically secure but personally distant. Octavia fulfilled ceremonial duties with quiet composure. She appeared beside Nero at public events. She participated in religious observances. Yet Nero's emotional world did not center on her. In these years, he formed attachments to individuals who shared his interests more closely. Among them was Poppaea Sabina, known for intelligence and self-assurance. Their association began gradually within court circles. Poppaea understood presentation and influence. She recognized Nero's desire for admiration beyond formal authority. Agrippina noticed the change in companionship. Her position relied partly on maintaining proximity to her son's private life. As new relationships formed, her insight diminished. She responded not with open challenge, but with attempts to reassert visibility. She appeared at audiences. She reinforced alliances with senators who had once supported her rise. Nero, aware of these maneuvers, felt pressure between loyalty and independence. His identity as emperor required singular authority, shared power, complicated perception. He began to move physically away from his mother's residence within the palace complex, choosing quarters that offered greater privacy. The transformation extended to symbols. Coins struck during the early years of his reign had displayed Agrippina's image prominently. Gradually, her presence faded from official representations. The visual language of empire shifted towards singular focus. Beyond Rome, events demanded attention. In Britain, unrest among certain tribes required firm military response. Reports described difficult terrain and scattered resistance. Nero delegated oversight to experienced commanders, trusting their judgment. In the east, negotiations concerning Armenia tested Rome's diplomatic balance with Parthia. Nero relied on correspondence and counsel rather than personal involvement, yet each decision reinforced his authority. The Senate continued to praise his moderation. Financial records indicated reduced extravagance in certain expenditures compared to earlier reigns. Nero seemed content to allow advisors space to manage technical matters while he cultivated image and presence. Yet, transformation is rarely linear. Within Nero's mind, awareness of expectation grew heavier. The legacy of Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius stood behind him. Each predecessor had left examples of strength and caution, excess and reform. Nero absorbed commentary from historians and orators who compared reigns quietly among themselves. He developed sensitivity to criticism. Reports of satirical verses circulating in certain districts reached his ears. Though minor, they unsettled him. Public admiration satisfied, whispered mockery disturbed. The desire to shape perception intensified. In response, he expanded patronage of the arts. Poets received stipends. Musicians were invited to court. Public festivals incorporated refined performances alongside traditional spectacles. Nero believed that culture elevated society and reflected enlightened rule. Some senators agreed. Others questioned whether imperial dignity required greater reserve. Agrippina's influence, meanwhile, encountered resistance. Burrus and Seneca maintained balance, advising Nero when tension threatened stability. They recognized that overt conflict between mother and son could unsettle the court. The separation between them reached a subtle turning point when Nero declined to consult her on an administrative appointment she had expected to influence. The choice signaled a shift from guidance to independence. Agrippina did not protest publicly, but those attentive to court life recognized change. Daily life within the palace mirrored broader transitions. Banquets became more elaborate under Nero's direction. Imported fruits and delicacies appeared regularly. Yet he maintained outward frugality in official accounts. Appearances mattered. The Praetorian Guard remained loyal, their prefect Burrus commanding respect. Nero ensured regular payment and acknowledgement of their role in securing his accession. Stability of the Guard underpinned his confidence. As months turned to years, the boy adopted by Claudius receded fully into the identity of emperor. Nero spoke less often of his childhood. He seldom referenced the exile of his mother or the uncertainty of early guardianship. Those experiences remained within him but were no longer part of public narrative. Transformation also touched religious observance. Nero participated in rituals honoring Jupiter and other deities, fulfilling obligations expected of the emperor as chief priest. Ceremonies reinforced continuity with tradition, yet his personal interests leaned toward aesthetic appreciation of ritual rather than theological depth. In the city's neighborhoods, citizens measured reigns by tangible effects. Grain prices remained stable. Infrastructure repairs continued. Crime rates fluctuated little. Nero's youth gradually became less notable, as familiarity replaced novelty. However, relationships within the imperial household grew increasingly complex. Poppaea's presence became more visible. Her conversations with Nero influenced tone and mood. Octavia's quiet distance contrasted sharply with Poppaea's vitality. Agrippina sensed marginalization. She possessed intelligence and determination, but recognized that direct confrontation risked isolation. Instead, she communicated through subtle reminders of her role in securing his throne. She referenced alliances forged during difficult years. She invoked loyalty owed to maternal sacrifice. Nero, approaching his mid-20s, reacted with mixed emotion. Gratitude mingled with frustration. He sought to define himself not as beneficiary of her strategy, but as autonomous ruler. This psychological transformation paralleled political consolidation. Nero began to assert preferences more confidently in council meetings. He overruled certain recommendations. He approved expenditures for artistic festivals that previous emperors might have deemed unnecessary. Seneca observed these developments with thoughtful reserve. He understood that youth evolving into authority often required assertion. His role shifted from shaping policy to moderating impulse. He encouraged Nero to consider legacy rather than applause. The city's mood during this period remained largely stable. Public works advanced, roads were maintained, military campaigns proceeded without catastrophic failure. The empire did not tremble. Yet within Nero, subtle currents gathered. The adoption that had once elevated him now felt distant. He was no longer heir fulfilling expectation. He was sovereign defining direction. Transformation also influenced his perception of risk. Having grown up amid exile and political maneuvering, he understood the fragility of favour. Now that power lay in his hands, he felt both secure and exposed. The greater the authority, the greater the visibility. He responded by refining his public persona. Appearances at games were choreographed carefully. Speeches emphasized generosity and fairness. He cultivated an image of approachability while maintaining imperial distance. Agrippina's circle of supporters narrowed. Some senators adjusted loyalties to align more closely with Nero's independent authority. Influence in Rome flowed toward perceived permanence. At this stage, no single event defined the reign. Instead, transformation occurred through accumulation. Nero's confidence strengthened. His reliance on his mother diminished. His devotion to art deepened. His sensitivity to criticism sharpened. The empire's vast machinery continued its steady motion. Legions rotated along frontiers. Tax collectors tallied revenues. Engineers inspected aqueduct arches. Merchants loaded ships at Ostia. For most inhabitants, Nero's internal evolution remained invisible. Yet within the palace, change had weight. The adopted son of Claudius had become something distinct from his predecessor's design. He was shaped by early instruction yet guided increasingly by personal inclination. By the time Nero entered his mid-20s, the careful balance that had marked the beginning of his reign had shifted almost imperceptibly. The structures remained in place, Seneca advising, Burrus commanding the Praetorian Guard, magistrates handling routine administration, but the centre of gravity was changing. Nero no longer felt like a young ruler guided by experienced hands. He felt increasingly like the axis around which Rome turned. His days followed a rhythm that blended duty and inclination. Mornings were reserved for official matters. Petitions were read aloud by secretaries. Disputes between provincial governors were summarized. Financial reports were presented in orderly fashion. Nero listened, asked measured questions, and approved decisions that aligned with the policies shaped in earlier years. His attention to detail impressed some senators who had initially doubted him. After the formal obligations of the morning, his schedule opened. He withdrew into private courtyards shaded by colonnades. There, music tutors waited, with instruments polished and tuned. Nero practiced deliberately, focusing on technique rather than improvisation. He treated music not as diversion but as discipline. The repetition of scales and vocal exercises offered him a clarity different from the layered complexity of politics. This dedication to artistic refinement did not yet spill fully into public life. Performances remained within controlled circles. Trusted companions attended rehearsals. Their applause was enthusiastic but limited. Nero absorbed their approval with visible satisfaction. He began to imagine a Rome where artistry held equal standing with military conquest. In the broader city, daily routines continued without disruption. Bakers marked their loaves with stamps identifying their workshops. Public baths filled with steam as citizens moved between hot and cold pools. Street vendors called out prices for figs and olives. The amphitheatres hosted spectacles funded by the imperial treasury, maintaining goodwill among the population. Agrippina's presence in Nero's life diminished further during this period. She no longer attended council meetings. Her quarters on the Palatine felt separate from the flow of decision-making. She retained loyal supporters, but their influence waned as Nero asserted independence more openly. The emotional distance between mother and son did not erupt into open confrontation. Instead, it expressed itself in reduced communication. Nero responded politely to her messages, but no longer sought her counsel. Agrippina, who had once orchestrated his rise with precision, now watched as his authority crystallized without her involvement. In matters of marriage, the divergence became visible. Octavia fulfilled ceremonial duties with consistent dignity, yet her relationship with Nero lacked intimacy. She represented stability and legitimacy, but not companionship. Nero's attention increasingly gravitated toward Poppaea Sabina, whose confidence and conversational skill complemented his artistic sensibilities. Poppaea understood the nuances of court life. She navigated social gatherings with assurance, offering praise without appearing submissive. Her presence at private banquets brought a new tone, less formal, more animated. Nero found in her company a sense of affirmation that extended beyond political obligation. Meanwhile, Seneca observed these shifts with quiet caution. He recognized that Nero's desire for admiration could, if unchecked, distort priorities. His guidance grew more philosophical. He spoke of the burdens of fame and the responsibility that accompanied applause. Nero listened respectfully, though not always with agreement. The Praetorian Guard under Burrus remained disciplined. Their loyalty was sustained through regular payment and acknowledgement. Nero visited them periodically, reinforcing connection. Stability within the Guard ensured that the capital remained calm. Beyond Rome, developments required attention. In Britain, the revolt led by Boudicca had shaken Roman authority years earlier, but by this stage, order had largely been restored. Reports of reconstruction and consolidation arrived regularly. In the eastern provinces, diplomacy with Parthia achieved cautious equilibrium regarding Armenia. Nero's administration benefited from capable generals who executed policy without requiring his direct presence. The Senate, accustomed to the steady governance of Claudius, adjusted to Nero's evolving style. Some appreciated his patronage of the arts, viewing it as cultural enrichment. Others worried privately that performance and spectacle might overshadow traditional virtues of restraint. Nero's transformation during these years was not abrupt, but gradual. He began to attend public games with heightened engagement, acknowledging cheers with deliberate gestures. His awareness of the crowd's response intensified. Applause became a measure of connection. He also expanded festivals celebrating Greek traditions. Athletic contests and musical competitions were organized with increasing regularity. While Roman culture had long absorbed Greek influence, Nero's enthusiasm elevated it visibly. Intellectuals welcomed this shift. Conservative senators regarded it with measured skepticism. Agrippina's attempts to reassert influence grew more subtle. She cultivated relationships among senators uneasy with Nero's direction. Rumors circulated of her dissatisfaction. Nero heard these whispers through informants. His reaction combined irritation and resolve. He did not confront her directly, but ensured that her access to resources and communication channels narrowed. Within the palace, daily life reflected shifting alliances. Banquets featured elaborate menus, imported fish, seasoned meats, fruits preserved in honey. Musicians performed between courses. Conversation drifted from provincial affairs to poetic composition. Nero's participation was animated, his gestures expressive. Octavia remained present but peripheral. Poppaea's influence deepened. She encouraged Nero's artistic ambitions and reinforced his sense that Rome could be reshaped aesthetically as well as administratively. The city outside the palace walls felt little immediate consequence. Grain shipments arrived as expected. Public works continued. Law courts functioned. Nero's reign still appeared measured in tangible stability. Yet within Nero's inner life, a shift toward personal expression gained strength. He began composing verses himself. He practiced recitations, testing rhythm and phrasing. He imagined audiences beyond Rome, perhaps in Greek cities where performance by leaders was more accepted. Seneca's counsel grew more pointed. He reminded Nero that authority required balance between private desire and public duty. Nero did not dismiss him, but he sensed tension between philosophical restraint and artistic expansion. The death of Burrus in 62 AD marked a turning point in court dynamics. Burrus had been a stabilizing presence, managing the guard with steady competence. His absence altered equilibrium. The appointment of new prefects introduced uncertainty within the military command structure. Seneca, increasingly aware of changing currents, requested permission to withdraw from public life. Nero granted it. The philosopher's departure removed another moderating voice. Nero now stood more independently than at any previous moment of his reign. Agrippina's isolation intensified. Her earlier authority had faded. Nero's patience with perceived interference diminished. The relationship that once symbolized partnership now represented constraint. In the city, the population remained attentive but not alarmed. They judged the emperor by immediate conditions. Food remained accessible. Entertainment continued. Taxes did not rise dramatically. Nero's transformation into a ruler guided by personal inclination rather than shared counsel progressed steadily. He envisioned Rome as a stage not only of governance but of cultural brilliance. His interest in architecture began to expand. He studied plans for new buildings, considering how space could reflect aesthetic harmony. The emperor's court gradually adopted a tone reflecting his tastes. Artistic discussions occupied increasing time. Invitations extended to performers from Greek cities. Public competitions gained prominence. Yet beneath this outward refinement, unease circulated among segments of the elite. They questioned whether imperial dignity required a degree of reserve, incompatible with Nero's enthusiasm for performance. The machinery of empire rarely paused, even when the character of its ruler shifted. By the early 60s AD, Nero had moved beyond the sheltered structure of his early reign. The guiding hands of Burrus and Seneca were either gone or distant, and the court began to reflect his preferences more openly. Authority, once shared in subtle ways, now gathered around him more tightly. Morning audiences still took place in formal sequence. Magistrates entered in prescribed order. Provincial envoys presented gifts symbolic of loyalty, fine textiles from the East, carved ivory from Africa, metalwork from Spain. Nero listened with composed attention. He had learned to maintain an expression that revealed little. Yet those who observed closely could detect moments when his interest sharpened, particularly when discussion turned toward architecture, festival planning, or artistic exchange with Greek cities. Rome itself remained layered and restless. The population had grown steadily. Multi-story insulae leaned over narrow streets where sunlight filtered in only briefly each day. The wealthy maintained spacious villas with interior gardens and fountains fed by aqueducts. The contrast was accepted as part of the city's order. Bread distribution points operated regularly. Public baths offered both cleanliness and conversation. In the Circus Maximus, chariot races continued to attract crowds from every district. Nero's relationship with Octavia reached a quiet breaking point. The marriage, arranged for legitimacy, had never grown into partnership. Rumours circulated that Nero sought annulment. Octavia's supporters within the Senate watched carefully. Public sympathy often leaned toward her, as she represented continuity with Claudius's line. At the same time, Nero's bond with Poppaea strengthened. She became more visible in courtly settings. Her presence influenced tone and decision-making. She encouraged Nero to assert independence fully, to step beyond earlier constraints. Conversations in private chambers extended late into the evening, touching not only on art but on political maneuvering. In 62 AD, Nero divorced Octavia. The act, though legally justified through charges of infertility, stirred unease among segments of the population. Public demonstrations of sympathy for Octavia appeared in subtle forms: graffiti, murmured conversations in bathhouses, quiet gatherings. Nero responded firmly, ensuring that unrest did not escalate. Octavia was eventually exiled. The removal of Octavia marked a psychological threshold. Nero had acted decisively against established expectation. He married Poppaea soon after, solidifying her position within the palace. The transition altered court dynamics significantly. Agrippina's role had already diminished, but this development deepened distance. Her earlier influence over marriage alliances had evaporated. Nero's decisions now reflected his own priorities rather than inherited strategies. Meanwhile, administrative governance continued with measured competence. The empire's financial accounts were monitored carefully. Nero showed interest in reducing certain indirect taxes, aiming to maintain goodwill among traders. Public works, including improvements to roads and marketplaces, advanced steadily. Cultural festivals expanded in scope. Nero announced competitions modelled on Greek games, incorporating musical and athletic events. The innovation reflected his admiration for Hellenistic traditions. Participants travelled from distant cities to compete. The spectacle drew both praise and skepticism. In the provinces, conditions remained relatively stable. Military commanders along the Rhine maintained defensive positions. In Judea, tensions simmered quietly, but had not yet erupted into full rebellion. Reports from Syria and Asia Minor indicated steady commerce. Within the palace, Nero's daily life acquired increased complexity. Banquets became more elaborate in presentation, though not necessarily extravagant in cost. Lighting arrangements were adjusted to enhance atmosphere. Musicians performed structured compositions. Nero occasionally joined them, though still within semi-private settings. His sensitivity to public perception intensified. Informants relayed commentary from different quarters of the city. Praise reassured him. Criticism unsettled him. He developed a habit of inquiring about crowd reactions after festivals. The desire to be admired for more than authority became central. Seneca's withdrawal left a noticeable absence in philosophical discourse. The emperor now relied more heavily on courtiers who shared his tastes rather than challenging them. The tone of advice shifted from restraint to affirmation. The Praetorian Guard, under new leadership, maintained outward loyalty. Nero ensured regular engagement with officers, reinforcing bonds. Stability within the Guard remained essential to preserving calm in the capital. As these internal shifts unfolded, the physical structure of Rome continued to demand attention. Wooden apartment buildings stood densely packed in certain districts. Fires were not uncommon in such environments. City officials enforced regulations regarding construction, yet enforcement varied. Nero began to contemplate architectural renewal. He studied plans for improved urban layout, wider streets, and more resilient materials. The idea of reshaping Rome according to rational design appealed to him. The city's organic sprawl contrasted with the ordered symmetry he admired in Greek architecture. In the midst of these reflections, a personal tragedy struck. Poppaea, pregnant, died in 65 AD. Ancient sources offer differing accounts regarding the circumstances, but her death deeply affected Nero. The loss removed not only a companion but a central figure in his emotional world. Public mourning ceremonies were organized with solemn dignity. The event altered Nero's demeanor. He withdrew temporarily from festivities. Court life grew quieter. For a period, governance resumed its earlier measured rhythm, though beneath it lay grief. Agrippina, whose relationship with Nero had become strained long before, remained largely absent from these developments. Their separation had evolved into near-complete estrangement. The influence she once wielded existed now primarily in memory. Rome, meanwhile, continued its routines. Markets opened, ships docked, festivals marked religious calendars. The emperor's private sorrow did not immediately disrupt civic life. Yet within Nero, a growing conviction took shape, that Rome required transformation not only politically but physically. The dense arrangement of buildings, the narrow streets, the vulnerability to fire, all these seemed to him signs of outdated design. He began discussing large-scale urban planning with architects. The Senate responded cautiously. Such projects demanded funding and coordination. Some welcomed modernization, others feared excessive concentration of imperial vision, flames in the capital. In the summer of 64 AD, Rome carried the familiar weight of heat. The stone of the streets held warmth long after sunset, and the air in the lower districts felt heavy with smoke from cooking fires, lamps, and workshops. Life continued as it always did in a city where millions of small actions, baking, hauling, bargaining, repairing, carrying water, kept the imperial capital alive. Rome was not a single city so much as a collection of districts pressed tightly together. On the hills, wealthy households enjoyed courtyards and gardens. Below, in the valleys and near the river, dense neighborhoods formed a maze of apartment buildings, storage rooms, and shops built from timber, plaster, and whatever materials were cheapest. The arrangement suited commerce. It also created risk. Fires were common in Rome, and every summer increased the danger. People knew this in a practical way. They kept water jars close. They listened for the shouted warnings that might come in the night. But familiarity can dull caution, and in a city so crowded, even careful people were exposed to the mistakes of others. The district around the Circus Maximus was especially vulnerable. It was a busy commercial zone, packed with vendors who depended on the constant traffic of crowds drawn to races and festivals. Stalls and shops sold oil, cloth, wooden utensils, ropes, and other goods that burned easily. Storerooms contained stacks of goods waiting for sale. There were taverns where lamps stayed lit late, and cooking fires that burned until the last customers left. The streets were narrow, built up over generations without any master plan. Once a fire took hold there, it would find fuel faster than it would find resistance. When the first flames appeared, they did not announce themselves as a turning point in history. They arrived as fire always arrived in Rome. A sudden glow, a burst of heat, then a rush of movement as neighbours shouted and ran for buckets. At first it seemed like the kind of emergency that could be contained if the wind stayed calm and the crowd worked together. But the wind did not stay calm. It carried sparks across roofs and into alleyways where stored goods waited in darkness. The fire began to move faster than human hands could follow. Panic spreads in a city by sound as much as by sight. People heard the crack of beams, the collapse of roofs, the roar that rises when many fires merge into one. They heard the shouts of those trying to pull possessions from upper floors before staircases burned. They heard animals trapped in stalls. They heard the confusion of families trying to stay together in the smoke. For Nero, the fire arrived first as news, and then as urgency. He was away from the capital when it began, staying in Antium, the coastal town tied to his earliest memory and to his family's identity. The distance mattered only for hours, because messages moved quickly when the capital was in danger. Couriers rode hard, changing horses, carrying brief reports that grew worse as they travelled. By the time the information reached Nero clearly, the fire had already become something beyond a localized disaster. Nero returned to Rome without delay. The journey that might have felt routine in normal circumstances now carried the pressure of being too slow. Even before he reached the city's outskirts, smoke would have been visible, drifting above the skyline. Rome was a place of temples and monuments meant to symbolize permanence, but smoke ignores symbols. It crosses hills and settles into courtyards. It makes the familiar strange. When Nero entered the capital, he met a city already reacting. Refugees flowed toward open spaces, toward the Field of Mars, toward gardens, toward any wide area where fire could not easily follow. Those who could afford it moved their families to the houses of friends on higher ground. Those without connections carried what they could. Many carried household gods in small wooden cases, because for Romans, religion lived in the home as much as in temples. People took bedding, clothing, tools, coins, and keys. Keys often kept even when there was no longer a door to lock, because keys were proof of what had been theirs. The fire did not behave like a single line advancing. It behaved like many fires at once, breaking out wherever sparks landed, flaring when wind fed it, dying briefly where stone walls interrupted it, then returning where an alley opened into another crowded block. It moved across the city with a kind of grim intelligence that was really only physics. Fuel, airflow, and structure. Nero's role in such a crisis could not be ceremonial. He could not simply appear at temples to offer vows and then retreat. The city required practical decisions. Ancient narratives would later present arguments about his character, whether he was cruel, indifferent, theatrical, or genuinely concerned, but administrative actions are easier to trace than motivations. Relief was organized. Public buildings were opened. The imperial gardens were used as shelter. Space on the Campus Martius was turned into temporary refuge, because the displaced needed land as much as they needed food. Rome's grain supply was one of the empire's vital systems, normally kept steady through shipments from Egypt and North Africa. In a crisis, this system could become a tool of calm or a trigger for riot. Nero ensured that grain was distributed to those who had lost everything, and that prices did not surge beyond reach. He arranged for temporary markets where supplies could be accessed without crowds clogging narrow streets. The city also needed manpower. Fires in Rome were fought by neighbours, by slaves, by organised crews, and by soldiers when necessary. But in a disaster of this scale, coordination mattered more than individual effort. Nero's administrators had to manage access to water sources, prioritise the protection of key structures where possible, and prevent stampedes. In neighbourhoods where the fire was still approaching, people could be urged to evacuate early rather than wait until smoke-filled stairwells. For days the fire continued. It became part of the city's air and sound. Night offered no relief. Flames lit the sky in place of moonlight. In that glow, familiar landmarks looked distorted. Statues cast moving shadows. Columns appeared as silhouettes. The fire turned the city into a shifting landscape, and in that landscape, the normal hierarchy of Rome weakened. A senator might be seen carrying belongings like any other man. A slave might direct strangers toward a safe path. Fear redistributed attention. When the fire finally began to subside, it did not end cleanly. It left pockets of heat and embers that could flare again. Some areas that seemed spared at first later caught fire because sparks travelled unseen. For many residents, the disaster contained two experiences. The first flight, then the sudden realization that what was saved might still be lost. After the flames, Rome became quieter, not because grief is silent, but because the usual noise of commerce was interrupted. Places that had been crowded became empty stretches of blackened foundations. The smell of burned timber lingered. Dust and ash coated surfaces. The city's infrastructure was damaged unevenly. Some aqueduct-fed fountains still ran. In other areas, pipes and channels had been disrupted. The normal pathways through the city were broken by debris and collapsed walls. Nero faced the immediate task of order. Rome could not remain a field of ruins without becoming vulnerable to violence and disorder. With so many displaced, the risk of theft and conflict rose quickly. The Praetorian Guard and City Watch had to patrol areas where people were attempting to recover what they could. Property disputes began almost at once. In a city where ownership depended on documents and witnesses, fire destroyed records, and many could no longer prove what had been theirs. Nero's administration began organizing rebuilding, but rebuilding required planning. Rome had grown organically, often without regulation. If the city was to recover and be safer, this was the moment to impose a new layout. Wider streets would reduce the spread of future fires. Stone construction would make disasters less frequent. Porticos and open spaces could serve as fire breaks. These ideas were not purely aesthetic, they were practical. But practicality in Rome always had a political dimension, because rebuilding meant deciding whose land remained whose, where roads would cut through, and which districts would be prioritized. Nero engaged with the project of reconstruction in a way that reflected his personality. He was drawn to design, to scale, to the idea of shaping an environment rather than merely maintaining it. A city could be governed not only through laws but through space. If streets were wider, crowds moved differently. If public buildings were more visible, authority felt different. If certain parts of the city became more orderly, the empire's centre could appear renewed. Yet as soon as rebuilding began, so did suspicion. Rome was a city of talk. In bathhouses, in taverns, on street corners, people exchanged explanations. Large disasters demand cause, because cause offers a sense of control. If a fire was simply accident, magnified by density and wind, then it could happen again. If it was deliberate, then someone could be blamed. Some rumours placed blame on fate or divine anger. Others blamed ordinary negligence, but the most dangerous rumours aimed upward, toward the palace. In a monarchy without explicit constitutional limits, the emperor's motives were always discussed. Nero's interest in architecture and performance made him especially vulnerable to the idea that he might enjoy spectacle even in catastrophe. Even if he did not ignite the fire, some would suspect that he could benefit from destruction by clearing land for new projects. Nero's response had two dimensions. One was practical, intensified relief, visible involvement, and the quick launch of rebuilding regulations. The other was political, the need to redirect blame. In Rome, scapegoating had deep roots. Public anger needed an object, and in imperial politics, allowing anger to remain without direction was dangerous. At this time, a small but noticeable religious community existed in the city: Christians. They were not the largest minority, nor the most politically influential, but they were distinctive. They did not participate in Roman civic religion in the same way as others. They met privately, and their gatherings were often misunderstood. In a society where public religious rituals were tied to loyalty, refusing to participate could be interpreted as hostility toward the community itself. Suspicion did not require evidence, it required difference. Nero's administration moved against Christians in the aftermath of the fire. Accusations were made, arrests followed. The punishments described by later writers were brutal and intended as public display. For Nero, this served as an answer to rumour, a clear assertion that the state had identified a culprit. For the population, the effect was complicated. Some accepted the explanation, eager for certainty. Others felt discomfort at the cruelty, not because Romans were strangers to punishment, but because the suffering of scapegoats did not rebuild homes. While these persecutions unfolded, rebuilding remained the central work of the city's recovery. Nero established new regulations, restrictions on wooden construction in certain areas, requirements for spacing, and guidelines for the height and materials of buildings. He pushed for the use of brick and stone, materials more costly but more resilient. He encouraged colonnaded walkways along streets, creating spaces that provided shade and also separated structures, reducing the chance of fire spreading quickly. The reconstruction also required money. Rome's treasury, while supported by provincial taxes and imperial estates, was not limitless. Funding relief and rebuilding increased financial pressure. Nero's administration sought resources through careful adjustments, raising certain levies, requiring contributions from wealthy individuals, and managing provincial revenue more closely. Even with these measures, there would be resentment. In an empire where the capital expected to be supported by distant provinces, additional demands could strain loyalty. Within the palace, Nero's inner life during these months was shaped by conflicting experiences. On one hand, the disaster offered him a role as organizer and visionary. He could appear as the emperor who rebuilt Rome stronger. On the other hand, the suspicion that followed him, the whisper that he had caused it or welcomed it, cut at his sensitivity to reputation. Nero cared intensely about how he was seen. His desire for admiration was not superficial. It was tied to how he understood authority. If he could not be loved, he would at least be feared or obeyed, but he preferred love. The fire, therefore, became not only a civic disaster, but a personal challenge. It forced Nero to confront a truth about Rome. The emperor could not control what the city believed. He could distribute grain, organize shelter, and legislate construction. But rumor moved through social networks beyond official reach. This realization would shape the later years of his reign, when he became increasingly concerned with controlling narrative as much as controlling policy. In the physical landscape of Rome, one project quickly became emblematic of Nero's ambitions: the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. The concept was not simply a larger residence. It was an architectural statement. It included gardens and open spaces that contrasted sharply with the dense, cramped quarters many Romans lived in. It used innovative building techniques and lavish decoration. It represented Nero's belief that the emperor could reshape Rome into an environment worthy of imperial power and artistic grandeur. For supporters, the Golden House was a symbol of renewal and creativity. For critics, it was evidence of indulgence built on the ashes of citizens' homes. Even if the palace occupied land acquired legally or through reshaping city plans, the emotional optics were harsh. People who had slept under temporary shelters in public gardens could see imperial construction rising in scale. Nero did not abandon public rebuilding in favour of private magnificence. Temples were restored, public buildings were repaired, infrastructure improvements moved forward. Yet the Golden House absorbed attention, and attention in Rome was political currency. The more it dominated conversation, the more Nero's enemies could frame him as a ruler who prioritized personal glory. At the same time, Nero's court grew more complex. Advisors with experience in administration continued their work, but Nero increasingly favored those who aligned with his tastes. Architects, artists, and performers gained access. Decisions about rebuilding included not only safety but aesthetics. Nero's Rome would be orderly, wide, impressive qualities he associated with greatness and with the kind of legacy he wanted. Daily life for ordinary Romans during Reconstruction was a mixture of hardship and adaptation. Many lived temporarily with relatives or in makeshift shelters. Employment patterns shifted. Demolition crews, brickmakers, carpenters, and labourers were in high demand. Markets moved to different locations as districts were cleared. The soundscape of the city changed. Instead of the usual constant commerce, many areas heard the repeated strikes of hammers on stone and the creak of carts hauling debris. Public ceremonies took on new meaning. Religious rituals for purification and rebuilding were performed. The state wanted to reassure citizens that the gods had not abandoned Rome. Nero participated in these events, balancing the appearance of piety with the appearance of leadership. In a city that believed divine favour mattered, such gestures were not optional. For Nero personally, the fire also reinforced his dependence on the Praetorian Guard and on loyalty within the elite. In times of stability, senators could afford private doubts. In times of crisis, their cooperation was required. Nero needed the Senate to approve measures, manage funds, and maintain provincial connections. He also needed the Guard to prevent unrest from turning into rebellion in the capital. This strengthened the emperor's awareness of power's foundations. Not abstract legitimacy, but practical loyalty. The months following the fire, therefore, became a long test. Nero sought to present himself as the protector who acted decisively. He used relief measures and building reforms as evidence of competence. He also used punishment to demonstrate control. Yet every action could be interpreted in multiple ways, and Rome's political class was skilled at interpreting. The crisis did not conclude with a single moment of recovery. It unfolded over years as reconstruction continued. New neighbourhoods rose with straighter streets. New regulations shaped how buildings were planned. The city gained more open areas and more stone construction, improving resilience. In this sense, Nero's policies did change Rome materially. But the fire also changed Nero. It accelerated tendencies already present. His sensitivity to public opinion, his desire to control narrative, his attraction to grand design, and his belief that legacy could be built through spectacle as well as governance. Rome's ashes became a mirror, reflecting both his ambitions and the doubts surrounding him. By the time the city began to look whole again, the memory of the disaster remained, and with it remained questions. The emperor might rebuild walls, but he could not rebuild trust easily once suspicion had settled into the public imagination. A city rebuilt, a court unsettled. When the worst of the reconstruction had passed, and Rome's streets began to fill again with ordinary noise rather than the crash of falling beams, a new phase of Nero's reign took shape. The city looked different. Wider streets cut through districts that had once been tangled. Porticos lined sections of road where pedestrians could walk in shade. Brick and stone replaced many of the wooden facades that had made earlier neighbourhoods so vulnerable. The skyline shifted subtly as new structures rose in measured alignment. For citizens returning to rebuilt homes or relocating to new ones, the change felt practical before it felt political. Fewer narrow alleys meant better airflow in summer. More open space meant that carts could pass without constant obstruction. The reforms, whatever their origin, improved daily life in visible ways. Builders and craftsmen found steady employment. Brickmakers, stonecutters, plasterers and labourers moved from site to site in organised crews. The smell of fresh mortar replaced the lingering scent of ash. Nero involved himself closely in these developments. He reviewed architectural plans, spoke with designers, and encouraged experimentation with vaulted ceilings and decorative interior spaces. The Golden House expanded across land cleared by the fire, its gardens stretching between hills, its artificial lake reflecting the sky where cramped streets had once stood. Visitors admitted into certain sections described walls painted with intricate scenes and ceilings designed to catch light at different hours of the day. To Nero, the palace represented not withdrawal but transformation. He believed that an emperor's residence could symbolize Rome's renewed confidence. Yet he also understood that grandeur carried risk. In a city where many still remembered sleeping in temporary shelters, magnificence could be interpreted as distance. The Senate's mood during this period was cautious. Some members appreciated the improved urban design and the restoration of temples damaged by the fire. Others spoke privately of cost. Reconstruction demanded resources. Provincial taxes were monitored carefully. Wealthy landowners were sometimes required to contribute to rebuilding efforts. The financial web of empire tightened. Nero continued to appear in public, attending games and ceremonies. His participation in festivals grew more pronounced. He did not limit himself to patronage. He performed. At first, performances were carefully staged in semi-private venues. Invitations were controlled. Applause was organized. But word travelled. The emperor's voice, trained and practiced, became a subject of conversation in markets and bathhouses. Roman tradition placed boundaries around aristocratic performance. Public recitation was acceptable within limits, but sustained artistic display by a reigning emperor unsettled expectations. Some admired his courage. Others felt discomfort. Authority in Rome had long rested on restraint and military command. Nero introduced a different model, the emperor as artist. His travels beyond Rome reflected this inclination. He expressed admiration for Greek culture openly. Greek cities, where rulers had long participated in artistic competitions, welcomed his interest. Nero envisioned himself not merely as Roman emperor, but as cultural leader across the Mediterranean. Within the palace, the atmosphere shifted again after the death of Poppaea. Her absence left a void in Nero's private world. Grief reshaped his evenings. Banquets became quieter for a time. He withdrew from some social gatherings, devoting more hours to music and composition. Loss sharpened his inward focus. At the same time, political tensions did not pause. In Judea, unrest intensified. Long-standing grievances regarding taxation and religious autonomy began to erupt into open rebellion. Reports from the province described skirmishes and resistance that exceeded routine disturbances. Nero appointed experienced commanders to address the crisis, recognizing that the stability of the eastern provinces was essential. Closer to home, whispers of conspiracy surfaced among members of the elite. The Pisonian Conspiracy of 65 AD involved senators, equestrians, and even individuals within the military who were dissatisfied with Nero's direction. The plot aimed to replace him with Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a figure perceived as more aligned with traditional aristocratic values. When the conspiracy was uncovered, Nero responded decisively. Arrests followed, interrogations were conducted, punishments were carried out. Among those implicated was Seneca, whose association with certain conspirators cast suspicion upon him. Though evidence of direct involvement remains debated, Seneca was ordered to take his own life. The philosopher who had once guided Nero's early years died in disciplined composure. The event marked a turning point. The removal of conspirators consolidated Nero's authority, but deepened fear among the elite. Trust eroded. Court life grew more cautious. Conversations were measured. Loyalty became performative. For Nero, the conspiracy reinforced his sense of vulnerability. Even after rebuilding Rome and maintaining stability, segments of the ruling class had sought his removal. His sensitivity to criticism hardened into vigilance. Informants gained prominence. Networks of surveillance expanded subtly. Yet he did not retreat entirely into suspicion. Instead, he pursued affirmation in domains where applause was unambiguous. In 66 AD, he embarked on a tour of Greece, participating in athletic and musical competitions. Greek audiences, accustomed to rulers performing publicly, responded with enthusiasm. Nero won numerous crowns in contests, though some victories were assured by status rather than pure competition. The journey served multiple purposes. It allowed Nero to distance himself temporarily from Rome's tense atmosphere. It also reinforced his self-image as cultural leader. Greek cities granted him honours and privileges, declaring festivals in his name. He announced the freedom of certain provinces as symbolic gestures of goodwill. Back in Rome, the administration continued functioning under appointed officials. Reconstruction projects advanced. The Golden House neared completion. Its vast statue of Nero, the Colossus, rose near the entrance, visible from a distance. The statue depicted him in idealized form, merging imperial authority with artistic identity. Meanwhile, the war in Judea escalated. Vespasian, appointed to command Roman forces, began methodical campaigns to regain control. The conflict would eventually reshape imperial politics, but during Nero's lifetime it remained one of several distant pressures rather than immediate existential threat. In Britain, stability held. Along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, legions maintained order. The empire, vast and interconnected, did not crumble during these years. Administrative systems proved resilient. Yet within Rome's political class, unease persisted. The memory of the fire, the executions following the conspiracy, and the emperor's artistic ambitions combined into a portrait that divided opinion sharply. Some saw innovation and renewal. Others saw deviation from ancestral norms. Nero's daily routine during his later reign reflected both power and isolation. Morning councils continued, but the circle of advisors had narrowed. Afternoons were devoted increasingly to rehearsal and composition. Evenings alternated between banquets and private study. His emotional world was complex, shaped by ambition, grief, suspicion, and genuine delight in art. As the 60s AD progressed, financial pressures mounted subtly. Reconstruction and public games required funds. Provincial revolts demanded military expenditure. Tax adjustments strained certain regions. In Gaul, dissatisfaction grew under the leadership of Julius Vindex, who criticized Nero's rule openly. The seeds of broader rebellion began to germinate. For Rome's ordinary citizens, however, life remained structured by routine. Markets operated, children learned trades, festivals punctuated the year. The emperor's image, whether admired or questioned, remained distant from daily survival. Stability was measured in bread prices and security, not in senatorial debates. Nero continued to cultivate his vision of Rome as cultural capital. He hosted competitions that blended music, poetry, and athletics. He appeared on stage in elaborate costume, confident in his training. Applause reassured him. In those moments, he experienced a clarity absent from political maneuvering. But politics never receded entirely. Reports from Gaul grew more serious. Vindex's revolt in 68 AD, though initially limited, signalled that opposition could take organised form beyond court whispers. The governor Galba in Spain declared support for resistance. Military loyalty, the true foundation of imperial power, began to waver. Nero's response combined dismissal and concern. He relied on the assumption that legions valued continuity and payment above ideology. Yet the empire's scale meant that dissatisfaction in one province could ripple outward. As news of defection spread, the Praetorian Guard in Rome reconsidered their position. Promises of reward from Galba influenced calculations. Loyalty, once firm, became negotiable. Within the palace, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Advisors urged caution. Messages were sent seeking reassurance from commanders. Nero, who had rebuilt Rome and celebrated triumphs in Greece, now confronted a different kind of challenge: political isolation. The city he had reshaped architecturally remained intact. Streets were wider, buildings were stronger, but the political foundations beneath his authority trembled. In these years following the fire, Nero had pursued transformation of space, of culture, of self. He had experienced grief and responded with creativity. He had faced conspiracy and answered with severity. He had sought admiration and found it abroad. Yet admiration does not always translate into enduring loyalty. As opposition gathered strength beyond Italy, Nero stood at the centre of a capital rebuilt in stone and marble. Uncertain whether the empire beyond its walls still held him as emperor, the empire turns. By the year 68 AD, the balance that had sustained Nero for more than a decade began to shift in ways that no architectural vision or artistic triumph could steady. Rome itself stood firm, its streets broader than before, its buildings rising in fresh stone, but the strength of the empire did not rest in masonry, it rested in allegiance. News from Gaul reached the capital with growing urgency. Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, had openly declared opposition to Nero's rule. His criticism centered not only on taxation but on the character of the emperor. He called for change in language that resonated with provincial elites who had begun to question the direction of Rome's leadership. At first, Nero treated the revolt as limited defiance. Provincial disturbances were not uncommon in an empire of such scale. Legions stationed along the Rhine had long experience in suppressing unrest. Orders were dispatched. Generals were instructed to respond with discipline and force. Yet Vindex's rebellion did not follow the pattern of a local uprising. He sought alliance. He appealed to Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, urging him to assume leadership in opposition to Nero. Galba, an older aristocrat with strong military connections, hesitated at first. Open rebellion was a grave step. But as dissatisfaction with Nero spread among certain provincial officers, hesitation turned into calculation. In Rome, Nero continued his daily routines with outward composure. He attended rehearsals. He consulted on administrative matters. He received envoys. But beneath the steady rhythm of appearances lay increasing tension. Reports were no longer isolated. They indicated coordination. The Senate reacted cautiously. Official declarations remained loyal, but private discussions grew sharper. Some senators considered whether Nero's artistic focus and recent purges had alienated too many influential figures. Others feared instability more than they disliked the emperor. The memory of civil wars still haunted Rome's political imagination. The Praetorian Guard held the key to the capital. Their prefects monitored developments closely. Loyalty had been reinforced over years through pay and privilege. Yet soldiers also listened to rumour. They calculated prospects. An emperor whose authority appeared to waver could become a liability. Nero's response to Vindex was initially firm. He declared him an enemy of the state. He relied on commanders in Germania Superior to confront the revolt. When Vindex was defeated and took his own life, Nero experienced brief relief. The immediate threat in Gaul appeared contained. But relief proved temporary. Galba did not retreat. Encouraged by shifting loyalties among legions and provincial administrators, he declared himself representative of the Senate and the Roman people. This phrasing carried weight. It suggested that opposition was not merely personal rebellion, but restoration of traditional authority. Within the palace, Nero's circle tightened. Advisors urged swift and decisive action. He considered leading troops personally, yet his experience lay more in ceremony and cultural patronage than in battlefield command. He also hesitated to leave Rome at a moment when political stability was uncertain. Publicly, Nero sought to project confidence. Games and performances continued. Announcements emphasized the loyalty of most provinces, yet attendance at spectacles did not carry the same tone as before. Applause was present but measured. The crowd sensed uncertainty. In the Senate, declarations of loyalty grew formulaic. Some members avoided direct statements. Messages from Spain and other regions indicated that additional governors were wavering. The empire's vast network, once a web of steady administration, began to feel like a series of shifting alignments. Nero's financial policies also drew scrutiny. Reconstruction costs from the fire and expenditures on festivals had strained resources. Though not catastrophic, the fiscal environment left little margin for crisis. Rebellion required mobilization. Mobilization required funds. As spring advanced, the Praetorian Guard began to reconsider its position more openly. Nymphidius Sabinus, one of its commanders, played a decisive role. He assured the soldiers that Galba would reward them generously if they shifted allegiance. Promises of donatives carried persuasive force in Roman military culture. Nero sensed loyalty thinning. He attempted to address the guard directly, offering reassurances and renewed promises. But confidence, once eroded, is difficult to restore through words alone. The guard calculated future stability. If Galba appeared likely to prevail, remaining loyal to Nero risked disadvantage. In the city, ordinary citizens followed events with limited clarity. Rumours circulated quickly, but details remained uncertain. Some worried about the return of civil conflict. Others remained detached, focused on daily survival. Within the palace, Nero confronted isolation. Advisors who had once encouraged his artistic pursuits now spoke in cautious tones. Courtiers weighed their own security. Communication from provinces arrived less frequently, or with ambiguous wording. The Senate's final shift occurred when news reached Rome that Galba had been recognized by several legions. Senators, sensing the tide turning, convened and declared Nero a public enemy. The act carried symbolic weight. It severed the formal bond between emperor and state. When the Praetorian Guard abandoned him, the foundation of Nero's authority collapsed. In the early hours following the Senate's declaration, Nero found himself increasingly alone. The palace that had once hosted banquets and rehearsals grew quiet. Servants hesitated. Guards withdrew. He considered fleeing to the east, where he believed loyalty might remain stronger. He thought of retreating to Greece, where he had been celebrated. Plans formed and dissolved quickly. Messages were sent seeking support, but responses were uncertain. Ultimately, Nero chose to leave the city. Accompanied by a small group of loyal freedmen, he travelled to a villa, outside Rome, belonging to one of his supporters. The journey was not ceremonial. It was discreet and hurried. For the first time since his accession, Nero experienced Rome without the shield of imperial presence. The roads that had once parted for his processions now carried him quietly, without escort. At the villa, he confronted the reality of abandonment. News confirmed that Galba had entered the capital. The Senate's declaration stood. The Praetorian Guard had shifted allegiance. Nero's final hours unfolded without spectacle. He paced. He considered options. He feared capture and humiliation. Roman tradition held that a defeated ruler might be paraded publicly before execution. The thought unsettled him deeply. In that private setting, removed from the marble halls of the Palatine, Nero faced the conclusion of his reign not as performer or architect, but as a solitary man. On June 9, 68 AD, Nero took his own life with assistance from a loyal companion. His death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had begun with Augustus nearly a century earlier. News of his death spread through Rome with mixed reaction. Some expressed relief, others mourned. For many citizens, the change signalled uncertainty more than resolution. The empire would soon enter a period known as the Year of the Four Emperors, as competing claims reshaped authority. Nero's body was buried quietly. The Golden House stood. The rebuilt streets remained. The reforms enacted after the fire endured in stone and regulation. His legacy, however, fractured into competing narratives. Later historians, writing under subsequent emperors, often emphasized excess and cruelty. Some accounts amplified rumour into certainty. Others acknowledged administrative competence alongside artistic ambition. For those who had lived through his reign, memory was more complex. They remembered the relief provided after the fire. They remembered the widening of streets. They remembered the music and festivals. They also remembered executions, suspicion, and instability. Nero had sought admiration, beauty, and legacy. He had reshaped Rome physically. He had pursued artistic expression beyond traditional boundaries. Yet the empire's loyalty proved more fragile than architecture. His death did not erase the changes he had made. It marked the end of one vision of imperial identity and the beginning of another. The capital he left behind remained standing wider, stronger, altered. But its emperor was gone. The morning after Nero's death did not feel like the end of an era. Rome woke the same way it always had, Bakers rose before dawn to knead dough in dim courtyards. Slaves moved quietly through wealthy houses to prepare basins of water for washing. Shopkeepers lifted wooden shutters from storefronts along streets that, only a few years earlier, had been blackened by fire and then rebuilt in careful lines of brick and stone. The Tiber continued its slow movement beneath bridges that had carried traffic for generations. The emperor was gone, but Rome did not pause. What changed first was not the city's physical rhythm, but its political language. Word spread quickly that Nero had taken his own life in a villa outside the capital. There had been no public execution, no spectacle in the forum. He had died privately, assisted by a loyal freedman, rather than face capture and humiliation. That detail mattered deeply to Roman sensibilities. Suicide, under certain circumstances, preserved a form of dignity. Capture would have erased it. In the Senate House, reactions were measured. There was no unified mourning. Many senators had lived through years of suspicion, watched colleagues accused in conspiracies, and calculated carefully which words were safe to speak. Now, with Nero gone, they faced the opposite challenge: how to respond to the sudden absence of imperial authority. Galba, already declared emperor by his supporters in Spain and backed by key legions, was approaching Rome. The Senate moved quickly to legitimize the transition. Nero was declared a public enemy after his death, a symbolic gesture that formally severed his bond with the state. It was an act meant to signal distance, to reassert senatorial authority, and to align with the momentum of military power. In the streets, news of the declaration produced mixed responses. Among sections of the aristocracy, there was relief. They believed a period of restoration might follow, less theatrical, more restrained, more aligned with ancestral traditions. Among the urban poor, the reaction was quieter. Nero had not been universally hated. He had distributed grain. He had staged public games. He had opened gardens to the displaced during the fire. For many, he had been visible and accessible in ways previous emperors had not. Memory in Rome was rarely uniform. As Galba entered the capital, he did so without triumphal display. He was elderly, austere, and determined to project discipline. His demeanor contrasted sharply with Nero's cultivated theatricality. Where Nero had performed before audiences, Galba stood stiff and restrained. Where Nero had expanded festivals, Galba signalled restraint in spending. Yet Galba inherited more than a throne. He inherited instability. The Praetorian Guard had shifted allegiance once. They had been promised rewards for abandoning Nero. Soldiers in Rome expected donatives, financial bonuses, traditionally granted at moments of accession. Galba hesitated. He believed discipline required control over military expectations. His reluctance planted early seeds of resentment. Beyond the capital, the empire did not move as one body. Legions stationed along the Rhine had supported Vitellius, a rival claimant. In the east, commanders watched developments carefully. The death of Nero did not unify the provinces, it opened opportunity. Within Rome, the dismantling of Nero's presence began quickly. The Golden House, once a symbol of imperial imagination, became politically dangerous. Its vast grounds represented not only architectural innovation, but concentration of space in one man's name. Galba, and those who followed him, understood that association with Nero's grandeur could weaken their legitimacy. Parts of the complex were stripped. Decorative elements were removed or repurposed. The artificial lake at its centre would eventually be drained to construct new public structures. The Colossus Nero's towering statue was altered, reshaped to represent different divine imagery. In reshaping stone, subsequent rulers attempted to reshape memory. Yet not all of Nero's changes were erased. The wider streets remained. The new building regulations continued. Brick and stone construction persisted as standard practice in many districts. The fire had forced structural reform that outlived its architect. In that sense, Nero's urban policies became embedded in the physical city, even as his name was publicly condemned. In households across Rome, conversation shifted gradually from crisis to comparison. Older citizens recalled the final years of Claudius. Some compared Nero's artistic interests to the administrative caution of his predecessors. Others remembered the generosity of early reign reforms. Those who had suffered under suspicion or lost relatives in purges did not soften their judgment. Rumour also began to circulate beyond Rome's walls. In the eastern provinces, particularly in parts of Greece and Asia Minor where Nero had been celebrated during his cultural tour, stories emerged that he had not truly died. The phenomenon of false Neros would appear repeatedly over the next decades, individuals claiming to be the emperor returned from exile. These pretenders gained small followings. Their existence revealed something essential. Nero's image had not been entirely negative across the empire. For communities that had benefited from his policies or admired his performances, his fall felt abrupt and unresolved. Meanwhile, in Judea, the war that had begun under Nero's rule continued under Vespasian. The campaign intensified, eventually leading to the siege of Jerusalem. Though Nero did not live to witness its outcome, the strategic decisions made during his reign shaped the conflict's direction. Imperial politics in Rome and warfare in distant provinces were intertwined. Back in the capital, Galba's authority proved fragile. His refusal to satisfy the Praetorian Guard's financial expectations weakened support. Otho, one of his former allies, capitalized on dissatisfaction. In January of 69 AD, Galba was assassinated by soldiers in the Forum. His reign had lasted barely 7 months. Rome once again confronted violent transition. Otho assumed power briefly, only to face opposition from Vitellius, whose legions advanced from Germania. Battles erupted in northern Italy. Roman fought Roman, as it had in earlier civil wars. The capital's stability, rebuilt after fire, now trembled under political rivalry. During this year of rapid succession, Nero's memory functioned as both warning and reference point. Each new claimant framed himself in contrast to the fallen emperor. Discipline was emphasized. Restraint was praised. Yet soldiers, who had once abandoned Nero for promised rewards, now shifted allegiance repeatedly based on calculation. When Vitellius entered Rome after defeating Otho's forces, the city endured chaos. Supplies strained. Discipline among troops faltered. The Senate, weary of instability, sought order above all. Ultimately, Vespasian emerged as victor. Backed by Eastern legions and supported by key generals, he secured control by the end of 69 AD. His ascent marked the beginning of the Flavian dynasty, a shift away from the Julio-Claudian line that had begun with Augustus. Vespasian's approach differed sharply from Nero's. He focused on fiscal repair. He restored discipline among soldiers. He initiated large public building projects, including the construction of the amphitheatre later known as the Colosseum, built on land, once occupied by Nero's artificial lake. The symbolism was clear: public entertainment replacing private extravagance. Yet, even as Vespasian restructured imperial authority, traces of Nero's reign remained embedded in Rome's memory. Writers began shaping narratives. Tacitus, Suetonius, and others recorded accounts that blended fact, rumour, and moral judgment. Stories of Nero singing during the fire gained dramatic force in retelling. Accounts of cruelty expanded. Scenes of theatrical excess became central to his characterization. Later generations would encounter Nero primarily through these texts, but lived experience had been more layered. Nero had presided over more than a decade of relative administrative stability before crises accelerated. He had invested in cultural exchange with Greece. He had enacted building reforms that improved urban safety. He had also authorized severe punishments and fostered suspicion within the elite. His fall demonstrated how quickly imperial loyalty could dissolve when military backing shifted. In Rome's marketplaces, Nero's name gradually became shorthand for excess among the upper classes. Among certain segments of the lower population, memory lingered differently, less as tyrant, more as benefactor. The divide reflected social experience. In the decades that followed, emperors learned from his reign. They understood that public generosity could build popularity, but not secure military loyalty indefinitely. They recognized that architectural ambition must be balanced with fiscal prudence. They saw that alienating the Senate risked instability. They also observed that personal performance, however skillful, could undermine traditional expectations of authority. Nero's death ended one model of imperial identity. He had attempted to merge ruler and artist, authority and applause, statecraft and spectacle. Rome's political culture, shaped by centuries of republican restraint before imperial rule, resisted that synthesis. Yet he cannot be reduced to caricature. He was born into instability, raised under ambition, educated by philosophers, elevated young, confronted disaster, surrounded by shifting loyalties, sensitive to admiration, vulnerable to criticism, capable of generosity and severity alike. When he died, the empire did not collapse, but it convulsed. The year of the four emperors revealed the fragility beneath apparent permanence. Rome survived because its administrative systems were resilient, because provincial governance functioned beyond personality, and because military power ultimately coalesced around a new dynasty. As the Flavian era stabilized the capital, Nero receded into contested memory. The Golden House disappeared beneath later structures. The statue that once bore his likeness was reshaped. Official condemnation attempted to erase his legitimacy. Yet the streets widened after the fire still carried traffic. The brick walls still stood where wood once burned. Rome moved forward, as it always did. But in its stones and stories, the imprint of Nero remained reshaped, debated, remembered differently by each generation that walked the city he had once ruled. The war in Judea Empire at its edge, far from the polished stone of the Palatine Hill and far from the carefully rehearsed performances that increasingly defined Nero's evenings, another version of the empire was unfolding. One that moved not through music or marble, but through marching boots, hardened discipline, and the unyielding logic of siege warfare. Judea had long stood as one of Rome's more delicate provinces, not because it lacked wealth or strategic importance, but because its people possessed a religious and cultural identity so tightly bound to land and temple that governance required more sensitivity than force alone. Rome had ruled the region through a combination of local client kings and imperial administrators, balancing taxation with religious accommodation, allowing worship to continue so long as loyalty to imperial authority was not openly challenged. Yet the arrangement was never entirely stable. Roman procurators rotated in and out of the province, some competent, others careless, and in the years leading up to open rebellion, resentment had deepened under heavy taxation and perceived corruption. When Gessius Florus assumed office as procurator, tensions escalated sharply. His extraction of funds from the temple treasury, whether driven by fiscal necessity or personal greed, was interpreted by many in Judea as sacrilege as much as exploitation. Protest followed, and protest soon turned into violence. Roman soldiers were attacked, symbols of imperial authority were defaced. Factions within Jerusalem began to organize openly against Roman presence, and once blood was spilled on both sides, the possibility of quiet reconciliation narrowed quickly. News of unrest travelled across the Mediterranean not as rumour but as official dispatch. Nero received reports describing garrisons under strain, tax collection disrupted, and entire districts refusing cooperation. For an emperor who governed an empire stretching from Britain to Syria, provincial disturbances were not uncommon, but Judea's rebellion carried a different tone. It was not simply a matter of replacing a governor or adjusting levies. It had the structure of organised revolt, and it touched religious conviction at its core. Nero did not rush east himself. Roman emperors were not expected to lead every campaign in person. Authority flowed through appointment, and Nero chose carefully when he selected Titus Flavius Vespasianus to command the suppression. Vespasian was experienced, pragmatic, and disciplined, a man whose earlier service in Britain had proven his capacity to endure prolonged operations in hostile terrain. Nero provided him with 3 legions and substantial auxiliary forces drawn from neighbouring provinces. And with that appointment, the war moved from provincial disturbance to full military campaign. While Vespasian gathered troops and began advancing methodically through Galilee, Nero remained in Rome, and the contrast between the emperor's world and the soldier's world was stark, though not contradictory. In Rome, the rebuilding after the Great Fire continued to shape urban life. Brick replaced timber, streets widened, porticos rose along main roads, and architects presented Nero with designs intended to combine safety with grandeur. Nero attended councils, approved financial disbursements, and continued cultivating his identity as patron of culture. In Judea, meanwhile, Roman legions marched across dry hills under relentless sun, constructing fortified camps each evening with mechanical precision, raising palisades, digging trenches, and preparing siege engines piece by piece. Soldiers ate coarse grain, salted meat, and whatever provisions could be secured locally. Discipline held the army together, and discipline was enforced without hesitation. The campaign unfolded gradually rather than through a single decisive clash. Vespasian's approach favoured isolation of rebel strongholds before direct confrontation. Coastal cities were secured first, cutting supply lines and preventing reinforcement from sympathetic regions. Towns that resisted were besieged. Those that surrendered were spared harsher consequences. A calculated strategy meant to weaken morale within Jerusalem without provoking unified resistance across the province. Back in Rome, the war did not immediately dominate daily conversation. Markets opened at dawn. Grain ships from Egypt continued to arrive at Ostia, their cargo essential for feeding the urban population. Spectacles proceeded as scheduled. Nero's appearances in public maintained a sense of continuity. Yet financial strain began to register in subtle ways. Campaigns required pay for legions, maintenance of equipment, transport of supplies, and coordination with provincial governors. Reconstruction of Rome after the fire had already drawn heavily upon imperial funds. Now, additional expenditures accumulated. Nero did not abandon his cultural ambitions, but the balancing of treasury accounts grew more delicate. Advisors monitored revenue streams closely, ensuring that taxation in stable provinces compensated for military costs in the east. As Vespasian advanced deeper into Judea, internal divisions within Jerusalem intensified. Rebel factions disagreed over strategy, over whether to negotiate or to fight without compromise. Food supplies were rationed. Control over the temple became intertwined with control over political leadership. Roman legions encircled key positions, constructing siege works designed to wear down defenders through attrition rather than reckless assault. The war was not swift, and its slowness amplified its cost. Reports sent to Rome described resistance fierce enough to demand persistence, but fragmented enough to encourage confidence in eventual victory. During this period, Nero embarked on his celebrated tour of Greece, participating in musical and athletic competitions that affirmed his devotion to Hellenic culture. Critics later seized upon the juxtaposition, an emperor performing abroad while war burned in Judea, but the structure of imperial governance allowed for such distance. Nero continued receiving updates. Decisions about reinforcement and funding were transmitted through correspondence. Yet perception matters in politics as much as reality. Among Rome's traditional elite, the image of an emperor crowned in Greek festivals while legions fought in distant provinces unsettled expectations about imperial dignity. Meanwhile, Vespasian's reputation grew steadily. Soldiers respected him for practical competence rather than theatrical flair. Provincial administrators noted his efficiency. He did not merely fight. He stabilized territory methodically, restoring taxation and infrastructure in areas retaken from rebels. Each success enhanced loyalty among the troops under his command. In an empire where military allegiance formed the backbone of authority, such loyalty carried long-term significance. By early 68 AD, Roman forces had subdued most of Judea outside Jerusalem. The city itself remained resistant, fortified by both walls and conviction. Vespasian prepared for extended siege operations, understanding that starvation and internal conflict might achieve what direct assault could not. At this moment, however, events in the western provinces altered the trajectory of the empire. Revolt in Gaul under Vindex and declaration by Galba in Spain signalled that Nero's authority at the centre was weakening. Vespasian paused to assess developments. His legions were intact. His campaign was progressing, yet the political landscape had shifted dramatically. When Nero died in June 68 AD, the war in Judea entered a new dimension. Vespasian, commanding seasoned troops and enjoying increasing respect, found himself positioned not merely as general but as potential claimant in a contest for imperial power. The year of the four emperors followed, and while Rome cycled through Galba, Otho and Vitellius in rapid succession, Vespasian consolidated support in the east. The legions that Nero had entrusted to him for suppression of rebellion became the instrument of dynastic transition. Ultimately, Vespasian would secure the throne, founding the Flavian dynasty. His son Titus would complete the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, destroying the temple and reshaping the religious and political landscape of the region for generations. Nero's role in the Judean War thus occupies a complex position. He did not command on the battlefield. He did not design siege engines or lead charges. His authority manifested through selection of the general and provision of resources. The war itself demonstrated the structural strength of Roman administration, its capacity to project power across vast distance. But it also revealed how military success could elevate commanders into political contenders. Nero sought admiration through architecture and performance. Vespasian earned allegiance through campaign and discipline. In the end, the empire tilted toward the latter. The war in Judea stands as testament to the dual nature of Roman rule during Nero's reign. At the center, culture, performance, and urban transformation defined the emperor's identity. At the edges, legions marched, rebellions were crushed, and authority was reinforced through force. The two spheres were not mutually exclusive, they were interdependent. Yet when instability reached Rome itself, it was the legions hardened on provincial frontiers that determined succession. Nero's appointment of Vespasian solved a provincial crisis, but inadvertently prepared the rise of the man who would replace him. Thus, at the empire's edge, beneath desert sun and against fortified walls, the future of Rome was quietly being forged. Even as the emperor in the capital pursued applause and renewal, the war did not begin as threat to Nero's throne. It became, through the mechanics of loyalty and ambition, part of the chain of events that ended his dynasty. Agrippina, the mother and the son. Long before rebellion broke out in distant provinces, long before Rome burned and rose again in brick and stone, the most consequential struggle in Nero's life unfolded not on a battlefield, not in the Senate, and not before a crowd, but inside the private chambers of the imperial household. It was a struggle that began when he was a child, and ended only when blood severed what ambition had once fused together. Agrippina the Younger did not merely give birth to Nero, she built him. Her life before his accession had been defined by instability. She had grown up within the Julio-Claudian dynasty, where exile, execution and suspicion were ordinary hazards. She watched relatives fall from favour under Tiberius. She endured exile under her brother Caligula. She learned early that survival in Rome required calculation sharper than affection. When she returned from exile and later married Emperor Claudius, she did not drift into influence by accident. She moved deliberately, positioning herself near power, cultivating alliances, and most importantly, elevating her son. Nero's childhood was shaped by her vigilance. Even in the years when he did not fully understand court maneuvering, he understood her intensity. She monitored his tutors, she arranged his associations. She ensured he appeared dignified in public. She knew that legitimacy in Rome was not guaranteed by blood alone. It required visibility and narrative. When Claudius adopted Nero, elevating him above Britannicus in succession, it was the culmination of her planning. When Claudius died and Nero became emperor at 17, Agrippina did not withdraw into ceremonial motherhood. She stepped forward as partner in governance. For a time, coins bore both their images. Foreign envoys saw her present at audiences. She received petitioners. Her presence in political life was extraordinary, even in a dynasty accustomed to strong imperial women. For Nero, those early months of rule were lived under her shadow. He relied on her experience. She had navigated exile and return, court rivalry and survival. She knew the personalities within the Senate. She knew which families required reassurance and which required caution. At first, their partnership functioned smoothly. Nero delivered speeches drafted with Seneca's guidance. Burrus managed the Praetorian Guard. Agrippina ensured that no decision endangered the stability she had engineered. But dependence does not sit comfortably with adolescence becoming adulthood. As Nero grew more confident, small shifts occurred. He began to receive advisors privately without consulting her. He responded to correspondence directly rather than through her review. The palace, once shared space of influence, developed invisible boundaries. Agrippina noticed. She had not invested years of risk and calculation merely to watch authority drift beyond her reach. When Nero formed attachments independent of her most significantly, his growing involvement with Poppaea Sabina, she understood the implications. Personal affection could redirect political gravity. Their conflict did not erupt immediately. It unfolded through gestures. Agrippina appeared at meetings uninvited, signaling continued authority. Nero responded by limiting access subtly. She cultivated senators who preferred stability rooted in tradition. He cultivated companions who admired his artistic interests. The tension intensified around Britannicus. Britannicus, the biological son of Claudius, remained alive during Nero's early reign. Though younger and politically sidelined, he represented alternative legitimacy. When Britannicus died suddenly at a banquet, likely poisoned the event, deepened suspicion within the palace. Though direct evidence remains debated, many contemporaries believe Nero ordered the act to eliminate rivalry. For Agrippina, Britannicus's death marked a turning point. She had helped elevate Nero above him, but the elimination of Claudius's son removed a stabilizing counterweight. It also demonstrated Nero's willingness to act independently in matters of succession. Their conversations grew colder. Agrippina reportedly reminded Nero of her role in his rise. She invoked loyalty owed to a mother who had risked exile and reputation for him. Nero, sensitive to suggestion that his authority was derivative rather than inherent, reacted defensively. He no longer wished to be seen as instrument of her ambition. Poppaea's influence deepened the divide. She understood that Agrippina's presence limited her own position. Encouraging Nero's independence served both emotional and political goals. The emperor's desire for admiration freely given rather than orchestrated by his mother, made him receptive. The palace atmosphere shifted from partnership to surveillance. Agrippina, aware that influence was slipping, began signaling alternative possibilities. Some accounts suggest she hinted at supporting Britannicus's memory, or even aligning with other claimants if Nero sidelined her completely. Whether exaggerated or not, such rumours reached Nero. He responded with distance first. Agrippina was relocated from the main imperial residence to a separate villa. Her access to guards and advisors was reduced. Public representation of her image ceased, yet physical separation did not eliminate tension. The most dramatic episode unfolded at Baiae, a coastal resort town known for villas and leisure. Nero invited Agrippina to visit. During the return voyage, a specially constructed boat was designed to collapse at sea, drowning her in what would appear an accident. The mechanism failed. Agrippina survived the collapse and swam ashore. When news reached Nero that she had lived, the fragile line between hesitation and final decision dissolved. He sent soldiers to her villa. Agrippina met them with composure. According to later accounts, she understood fully what was happening. She had survived exile and intrigue. She recognized inevitability. Her death severed not merely a personal relationship, but the foundational bond of Nero's reign. The aftermath reshaped him. Publicly, Nero justified the act by claiming she conspired against him. The Senate, accustomed to endorsing imperial decisions, accepted the explanation. But the moral weight of matricide lingered. In Roman culture, filial duty carried immense significance. Killing one's mother, even for political necessity, marked a transgression that rumour would never forget. Psychologically, Nero changed. Before Agrippina's death, his insecurity often manifested as negotiation. Afterward, suspicion hardened more quickly into elimination. The Pisonian Conspiracy years later would be answered with forced suicides rather than reconciliation. At the same time, a paradox emerged. Freed from her oversight, Nero's artistic ambitions expanded openly. He performed more boldly. He invested more fully in cultural festivals. The absence of her controlling influence removed restraint. Yet freedom did not produce serenity. Ancient writers report that Nero was haunted by dreams of Agrippina. Whether literal or symbolic, the persistence of her presence in narrative suggests unresolved conflict. The woman who had constructed his rise now existed only in memory, and memory does not submit to imperial decree. In political terms, her death consolidated his authority. No rival within the dynasty remained. No maternal voice counterbalanced his choices. The court reorganized around him fully, but the cost was internal. The story of Nero cannot be understood without Agrippina because she represented both origin and opposition. She was architect of his elevation and catalyst of his transformation. In removing her, he asserted independence at ultimate price. The empire did not collapse when she died. Administration continued. Provinces remained governed. But something within Nero's reign shifted permanently, from cautious partnership to solitary rule. The marble halls of the Palatine grew quieter after her absence, not because fewer people occupied them, but because one dominant presence had vanished. In the years that followed, through fire, conspiracy, and rebellion, the memory of Agrippina's ambition and her end would remain woven into the fabric of Nero's identity. Poppaea, Sabina, desire, power, and loss. If Agrippina represented structure and calculation, Poppaea Sabina represented something entirely different in Nero's life. She did not build his throne, and she did not instruct him in governance. What she offered was affirmation, not the strategic affirmation of political necessity, but the personal kind that answered his deepest need to be admired without condition. Poppaea came from a respectable equestrian family. She was intelligent, observant, and fully aware of how influence moved within imperial circles. By the time she entered Nero's orbit, she had already been married twice, including to Otho, a future emperor in his own right. She understood court dynamics and knew how to navigate them without appearing confrontational. Her strength lay not in visible command but in proximity. Nero's marriage to Octavia, Claudius's daughter, had always been political. It secured legitimacy and unified branches of the imperial family. Octavia conducted herself with restraint and dignity, fulfilling ceremonial duties without controversy. Yet the marriage lacked warmth. Nero, drawn toward performance and emotional intensity, found little companionship in formality. Poppaea offered contrast. She listened to his music not as obligation but as admiration. She praised his voice and encouraged his performances. In her presence, Nero did not feel measured against ancestral expectations. He felt affirmed as individual. Their relationship deepened gradually, but its implications were immediate. The palace was not merely residence, it was a political organism. Any shift in affection carried consequence. Octavia's supporters within the Senate watched closely. Agrippina, before her death, had recognized the danger Poppaea represented to her own influence. As Nero's attachment intensified, pressure mounted for formal change. Octavia was accused of infertility, a charge both convenient and difficult to contest. Divorce in imperial circles was not unprecedented, but it carried public resonance. Octavia was popular among sections of the Roman population. She embodied continuity with Claudius and the Julio-Claudian line. When Nero divorced her, murmurs filled the city. When he exiled her, sympathy turned into quiet unrest. Graffiti appeared expressing loyalty to Octavia. Crowds gathered briefly in protest. Nero's administration moved swiftly to suppress demonstrations, not with spectacle, but with removal. Octavia was eventually executed on charges of conspiracy. For Nero, the decision represented personal liberation. For many in Rome, it marked a line crossed. He married Poppaea soon after. As empress, she occupied the space Agrippina once had, but in a different mode. She did not attempt to govern directly. Instead, she influenced through conversation, suggestion, and reinforcement. Nero consulted her on matters beyond ceremony. Her approval mattered to him deeply. In these years, Nero's artistic pursuits intensified. He appeared publicly in performances more boldly than before. Poppaea encouraged this expansion, reassuring him that admiration outweighed criticism. Her confidence strengthened his resolve to redefine imperial dignity on his own terms. Yet the relationship was not solely about art. Poppaea was politically perceptive. She understood that Nero's survival depended on balancing the Senate, the military, and the populace. She advised caution when necessary, particularly in matters of image. Her presence softened certain impulses, even as it emboldened others. When she became pregnant, the palace atmosphere shifted again. An heir would secure succession in a way no artistic triumph could. Nero expressed visible anticipation. The prospect of fatherhood carried symbolic weight. It promised continuity beyond his own contested reputation. Then came the rupture. In 65 AD, while pregnant, Poppaea died. Ancient sources attribute her death to a violent kick delivered by Nero during an argument, though the certainty of this account remains debated. Whether through accident, illness, or rage, her death devastated him. Nero's reaction was not restrained. He organized elaborate funeral rites. He deified her, granting her honors typically reserved for imperial figures of extraordinary standing. He displayed grief publicly and privately. Banquets ceased for a time. Performances diminished. Those within the palace observed a ruler unsettled in ways deeper than political anxiety. Poppaea had offered him affirmation without calculation. Her absence reopened old insecurities. Without Agrippina's structure and without Poppaea's reassurance, Nero's emotional world narrowed. Grief reshapes perception. In the months that followed, Nero's suspicion of disloyalty intensified. The Pisonian Conspiracy, uncovered shortly after Poppaea's death, was met with decisive brutality. Executions and forced suicides removed perceived threats quickly. Whether grief heightened his severity cannot be proven, but the timing suggests emotional turbulence intersecting with political danger. He later married Statilia Messalina, but the union lacked the intensity of his bond with Poppaea. It restored ceremonial balance but did not replace the personal connection he had lost. For Rome, Poppaea's death marked another shift in tone. The palace grew less animated. Nero's performances continued, but observers sensed strain beneath them. Admiration from crowds could not substitute entirely for intimate reassurance. In the years leading toward rebellion in Gaul and Spain, Nero stood increasingly alone at the top of the imperial structure. Agrippina was gone. Poppaea was gone. Seneca had withdrawn and would soon die. Burrus had already passed. The circle that once moderated and affirmed him had dissolved. The relationship with Poppaea reveals a dimension of Nero often overshadowed by later caricature. He was not indifferent to attachment. He was not incapable of affection. His devotion, when engaged, was intense. But intensity without stability can unbalance authority. Poppaea's presence had steadied his artistic ambition and reinforced his identity. Her loss destabilized it. In the final years of his reign, as revolts gathered and loyalty thinned, Nero no longer had the private voice that once told him he was admired for who he believed himself to be. The Pisonian Conspiracy whispers in marble halls. By the year 65 AD, Rome did not outwardly resemble a city in crisis. Its markets functioned. Its temples stood restored. The wide streets introduced after the fire carried steady traffic. Games and festivals still drew crowds. To the casual observer, imperial life appeared intact. Yet beneath the calm surface, tension had been accumulating quietly among Rome's political class, and that tension would soon take organized form. Nero had now ruled for over a decade. The early years of careful governance under Seneca and Burrus had given way to more personal authority. Agrippina was dead. Burrus had died. Seneca had withdrawn from public life. Poppaea's recent death had left Nero emotionally unsettled. The Senate, long accustomed to imperial dominance, felt increasingly marginalized. Some members disapproved of Nero's public performances, viewing them as undignified for a Roman ruler. Others resented the executions that had followed earlier suspicions. Still others feared that proximity to power carried danger rather than opportunity. In this atmosphere, opposition began not as open rebellion, but as conversation. The man at the centre of the emerging plot was Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a wealthy and respected aristocrat known for his cultivated manner and measured temperament. Piso was not a military commander. He was not an outsider to the system. He represented what many senators considered traditional Roman virtue: restraint, lineage, and aristocratic dignity. Around him gathered a group of individuals from different backgrounds: senators, equestrians, military officers, even members of the Praetorian Guard. Their grievances were not identical, but they converged around a shared conclusion. Nero's rule had drifted too far from ancestral norms. Some disliked his artistic ambitions, others feared further purges. Some believed the empire required leadership that projected discipline rather than spectacle. The conspiracy developed carefully. Meetings occurred in private villas, under the cover of ordinary social gatherings. Plans were discussed in measured tones. The conspirators debated not only how to remove Nero, but what would follow. Piso would assume authority, ideally with support from the Senate and the Guard. The transition, they hoped, would appear orderly rather than chaotic. Yet conspiracies in Rome rarely remained secret for long. Information travelled through servants, freedmen, and informants. The imperial court, accustomed to vigilance, had developed networks attentive to unusual movement. A freedman named Milicus, attached to one of the conspirators, learned enough to suspect danger. Whether motivated by loyalty, fear, or self-preservation, he reported what he knew. The revelation unfolded rapidly. Names were named. Arrests began. Nero, already sensitive to betrayal, reacted not with hesitation but with swift investigation. The palace atmosphere shifted overnight from uneasy calm to charged interrogation. Accused individuals were detained and questioned. Some confessed under pressure, others denied involvement. The list of implicated figures grew. Among those accused was Seneca. The philosopher who had once guided Nero's early reign had long since withdrawn from active political life, citing ill health and desire for quiet reflection. Yet his association with certain conspirators cast suspicion. Whether he had direct knowledge of the plot remains uncertain, but in a court shaped by distrust, uncertainty was enough. Nero ordered Seneca to take his own life. The scene that followed became one of the most recounted in Roman history. Seneca, informed of the order, accepted it with composure consistent with Stoic philosophy. He gathered friends, spoke calmly, and opened his veins. His death symbolized not only the elimination of a potential conspirator, but the end of the intellectual restraint that had once shaped Nero's rule. The executions continued. Piso himself was compelled to end his life. Officers, senators, and others linked to the conspiracy met similar fates. The message was unmistakable. Dissent would not be tolerated, whether whispered in villas or discussed among friends. For Nero, the discovery of the plot confirmed his deepest insecurity, that admiration could conceal resentment. He had performed before the Roman people, had rebuilt their city, had staged festivals and granted privileges, yet within the elite, men had gathered to remove him. The emotional impact was significant. Suspicion became sharper. Nero relied more heavily on informants. Loyalty was evaluated not merely by public statements but by personal behaviour. The court's atmosphere tightened. Conversations grew cautious. Invitations were weighed carefully before acceptance. Publicly, Nero maintained composure. Games continued. Official ceremonies proceeded, but the Senate had been shaken. Many members had seen colleagues fall. Some had been forced to praise executions they privately feared. The delicate balance between emperor and aristocracy shifted decisively toward dominance rather than cooperation. At the same time, Nero's artistic pursuits did not cease. If anything, they intensified. He continued preparing for performances, perhaps finding in music a refuge from political tension. To some observers, this persistence reinforced criticism. To Nero, it affirmed identity. The conspiracy had demonstrated that not all opposition came from distant provinces. It existed within the capital itself, among those who dined beside him and applauded his speeches. In practical terms, the suppression of the Pisonian Conspiracy strengthened Nero's immediate authority. No organized alternative remained within Rome. Fear stabilized the Senate, at least temporarily. But fear does not generate loyalty. It suppresses expression. Beyond the capital, the legions continued their duties. In Judea, Vespasian's campaign advanced steadily. On the Rhine and Danube frontiers, soldiers maintained discipline. Yet in Gaul and Spain, dissatisfaction simmered. The memory of executions in Rome did not travel instantly, but it contributed to a growing perception that Nero's rule had hardened. Within the palace, the circle around Nero narrowed further. Trusted freedmen gained influence. Long-standing aristocratic families found themselves increasingly peripheral. The social composition of the court shifted. The Pisonian Conspiracy thus marked more than a failed plot. It marked the final erosion of partnership between Nero and the senatorial elite. From this point forward, his rule rested more visibly on control and spectacle than on cooperation. He had faced external rebellion in Judea. He had faced fire in the capital. Now he had faced betrayal within marble halls. Each event reinforced the same lesson. Power was fragile, and admiration could not be assumed. The Greek tour. The emperor, as performer, by 66 AD, Nero had reached a point in his reign where restraint no longer defined him. The early years, shaped by Seneca's philosophical moderation, were distant. Agrippina was gone. The Pisonian Conspiracy had been crushed. Poppaea's death had altered him emotionally. Suspicion lived beside authority. Yet amid political tension and administrative strain, one passion remained constant: his devotion to music and performance. In Rome, his appearances on stage had already unsettled sections of the aristocracy. A Roman emperor, in traditional expectation, embodied command, discipline, and martial dignity. He presided over games. He did not compete in them. He patronized art. He did not stand before an audience seeking applause. Nero had gradually challenged these boundaries, first in controlled settings, then publicly. Greece offered something Rome did not. In Greek cities, artistic excellence held civic prestige. Festivals celebrating poetry, drama, and music had long histories. Rulers and dignitaries participating in competitions were not anomalies but honored contributors. Nero admired Greek culture deeply. He studied its language and mythology. He respected its aesthetic discipline. To him, Greece represented refinement rather than indulgence. The decision to travel east was not impulsive. It required logistical preparation and political calculation. Leaving Rome for an extended period carried risk. Yet Nero felt confident. The capital had been rebuilt. The Senate subdued. The conspiracy eliminated. The war in Judea was under control through Vespasian's steady command. For Nero, this was a moment to claim cultural legacy beyond Rome's rigid expectations. The journey began with ceremonial formality. Ships prepared in Italian harbours carried imperial entourage, musicians, advisors, and attendants across the Ionian Sea. When Nero arrived in Greece, he was welcomed with enthusiasm. Cities that had once fallen under Roman domination now saw the emperor not solely as conqueror, but as participant in their cultural traditions. He entered competitions at the Olympic Games, the Pythian Games at Delphi, the Isthmian Games at Corinth, and the Nemean Games. These festivals, typically staggered across years, were reorganized to occur within a single cycle so that Nero could participate in all during his visit. The gesture itself reflected the deference Greek cities showed him. When Nero performed, he did so with serious preparation. He sang accompanied by the cithara. He competed in dramatic recitations. He followed formal rules of competition. Whether judges would have dared deny him victory is debated, but his commitment to rehearsal was genuine. He did not treat performance as trivial ornament. He treated it as discipline. Crowds responded warmly. In Greece, his artistic devotion aligned with cultural expectation. He received crowns symbolizing victory, not military triumph, but artistic excellence. The number of crowns he collected became part of the narrative of his journey. For Nero, this experience was transformative. In Rome, applause had often carried undercurrents of skepticism. In Greece, it felt unqualified. He was not emperor performing. He was performer who happened to be emperor. The distinction mattered to him deeply. He also made political gestures during the tour. He declared the freedom of Greece, exempting certain cities from taxation. The proclamation carried symbolic power, aligning him with Philhellenic tradition. Whether economically sustainable or not, it reinforced his identity as benefactor of culture. Meanwhile, back in Rome, reactions were divided. Among the urban population, Nero's absence was not immediately destabilizing. Administrative functions continued under appointed officials. Grain distribution remained stable. Public works did not halt. Among the Senate, however, his prolonged absence raised concern. An emperor's physical presence in the capital symbolized authority. Distance created opportunity for dissatisfaction to organize. Some senators questioned whether extended participation in festivals aligned with imperial responsibility. In the provinces, military commanders observed events with careful neutrality. The legions respected strength and discipline. Cultural devotion, while not inherently disqualifying, did not secure loyalty. Nero's time in Greece lasted over a year. He immersed himself fully in festival life. He studied theatre architecture. He admired the acoustics of ancient amphitheatres. He absorbed admiration as validation. Yet beneath the surface, the empire's political structure shifted. In Gaul, dissatisfaction grew under Julius Vindex. Heavy taxation and perceived mismanagement stirred resistance. Vindex criticized Nero openly, framing his opposition as defense of Roman virtue. His appeal reached Galba in Spain. Nero received reports of unrest while still abroad. At first, he did not react with alarm. Provincial dissent was not new. He believed loyalty in Rome remained firm, and that the legions would suppress limited revolt as they had in Judea. He returned to Rome in early 68 AD, crowned and celebrated, carrying symbols of artistic triumph. But the atmosphere awaiting him differed from the one he had left. The Senate's tone was cooler. The Praetorian Guard watched developments closely. Reports from Gaul were more serious than initially described. Galba had declared himself representative of the Senate and the Roman people. Nero responded with characteristic duality. He continued rehearsals. He maintained public appearances. He also prepared military response. Orders were dispatched. Loyalty was sought from commanders, yet the Greek tour had subtly altered perception. To critics, his year of performance symbolized detachment from pressing realities. To supporters, it symbolized enlightened leadership transcending purely martial identity. The divide widened. The most revealing element of the Greek tour lies not in the crowns he won, but in what the journey represented psychologically. Nero believed that rulership could encompass artistry. He believed admiration could strengthen legitimacy. He believed Rome could evolve culturally, as it had architecturally after the fire. Greece validated that belief, but Rome was not Greece. Roman political culture, shaped by centuries of republican memory and military conquest, valued discipline over performance. Even as empire expanded and wealth flowed, expectations of imperial masculinity remained rooted in command. The tour, therefore, crystallized tension between Nero's self-conception and Rome's inherited standards. When revolt intensified in Gaul and Spain, when Galba's claim gained traction, the legions did not rally around Nero's artistic triumphs. They calculated stability and reward. The applause of Greek theatres did not translate into military loyalty. As Nero faced the final months of his reign, he carried within him the memory of Greek acclaim, pure, enthusiastic, affirming. It stood in stark contrast to the tightening atmosphere of suspicion in Rome. The Greek tour did not cause his fall directly, but it sharpened the contrast between the emperor he wished to be and the emperor the empire required. He returned crowned. He would soon be abandoned. And in that contrast, the story of Nero's reign finds one of its clearest reflections. A ruler who sought to expand the definition of imperial greatness beyond conquest, yet who underestimated how firmly Rome's power rested upon the loyalty of men who marched, rather than men who applauded. Abandoned by the empire, the final unravelling. When Nero returned from Greece crowned with artistic honours, he did not return to celebration alone. He returned to uncertainty. The applause of Corinth and Delphi still echoed in his mind, but the mood in Rome felt altered. Reports from Gaul had hardened from complaint into rebellion. Julius Vindex had openly declared opposition. More dangerously, Servius Sulpicius Galba in Spain had aligned himself with the cause of change. At first, Nero did not interpret these developments as fatal. Provincial unrest had occurred before. The empire was vast. Communication was slow. Governors occasionally overstepped and were corrected. He believed that loyal legions would suppress revolt as they had in Judea under Vespasian. Confidence, for the moment, outweighed alarm. He convened advisors. Orders were drafted. Military preparations began. Funds were assessed. The treasury, strained by rebuilding and spectacle, required careful management. He considered leading troops personally, yet hesitation lingered. His experience lay in administration and cultural patronage rather than direct battlefield command. In Gaul, however, events accelerated. Vindex's forces clashed with legions loyal to Rome. Though Vindex would eventually be defeated and take his own life, his revolt triggered a broader consequence: Galba's declaration of imperial authority. Galba framed his claim not as personal ambition, but as restoration of the Senate's dignity and the Roman people's will. This language mattered. In Rome, senators listened carefully. They had endured suspicion and purges. They had watched colleagues fall in the Pisonian Conspiracy. The prospect of an emperor promising restraint appealed to many. Nero's immediate response was measured but anxious. He attempted to rally support within the capital. He addressed the Praetorian Guard, offering reassurance. He promised financial reward, but promises must compete with alternative offers. Galba's supporters had already whispered assurances of generous donatives to the Guard. Soldiers weighed options. Loyalty in Rome had always depended partly on payment and partly on confidence in future stability. Meanwhile, in the east, Vespasian remained cautious. His legions in Judea were powerful, but he did not immediately intervene in the western crisis. He observed the unfolding contest. Back in the capital, tension thickened. The Senate met in increasingly guarded sessions. Some members quietly shifted allegiance, preparing for the possibility that Nero's reign might end. Informants reported changing attitudes among elites. Nero sensed isolation creeping inward. He attempted public composure. Games were announced, ceremonies proceeded, but the crowd's energy felt different. Applause remained, yet beneath it was uncertainty. Rome had lived through abrupt change before, but the prospect of another civil conflict unsettled even seasoned citizens. The decisive shift came when the Praetorian Guard withdrew support. Their prefect, influenced by promises and calculations, persuaded the soldiers that Galba's victory was likely. When Nero attempted to address them again, he found doors closed. The men who once stood as shield of his authority no longer answered his summons. The Senate, recognizing the turning tide, declared Nero a public enemy. This declaration was not theatrical. It was administrative and final. It meant he could be hunted, captured, executed without formal trial. Within the palace, the atmosphere changed rapidly. Servants hesitated, guards disappeared, advisors offered conflicting suggestions. Some urged immediate flight eastward, others proposed negotiation. Nero moved through corridors that once echoed with confidence, now accompanied by only a handful of loyal freedmen. He sought refuge in the home of a supporter outside Rome. The journey was not ceremonial. He travelled at night, cloaked, aware that capture could occur at any moment. At the villa, he faced silence. Messages sent to allies brought little response. Legions that once bore his name on standards now considered alternative leaders. The empire, whose roads and aqueducts still functioned, had withdrawn its allegiance. Nero contemplated escape to Parthia. He imagined seeking support among eastern provinces where admiration for his Greek tour lingered. Yet such plans required time and escort, neither of which he possessed securely. He also feared humiliation. Roman tradition treated defeated rulers harshly. Public execution, paraded in chains before the crowd, was a fate he could not accept. The memory of applause still defined him. To be mocked in the forum would erase everything he believed he had built. As soldiers approached the villa to arrest him, Nero confronted the narrowing of options. He hesitated. Accounts describe him pacing, quoting lines from poetry, lamenting that, "What an artist dies in me," whether precisely spoken or later embellished. The sentiment reflects something true about his self-conception. He did not think of himself primarily as tyrant or administrator. He thought of himself as performer, patron, creator. Yet in that moment, none of those identities could protect him. Assisted by a loyal companion, Nero ended his life on June 9, 68 AD. He was 30 years old. His body was buried quietly by a few faithful attendants. There was no imperial procession, no public mourning decree. The Julio-Claudian dynasty ended without ceremony. In Rome, the news spread quickly. Some expressed relief, others remained silent. For the urban poor who had benefited from his games and grain, the reaction was muted rather than celebratory. For senators who had feared further purges, it was cautious satisfaction. But the empire did not settle immediately. Galba entered Rome and assumed power, only to fall within months. Otho followed, then Vitellius. Legions marched across Italy. Civil war erupted. Stability proved fragile. In retrospect, Nero's fall revealed something fundamental about imperial rule. Architecture, performance, public generosity. None of these could sustain authority if military loyalty dissolved. Rome's strength lay not only in its monuments but in the allegiance of its soldiers. Nero had reshaped the capital physically. He had widened its streets. He had envisioned cultural expansion, but he had not secured the enduring loyalty of the legions that defined imperial survival. In the quiet after his death, Rome stood unchanged in stone yet altered in memory. Rome did not end with Nero. The city remained where it had always stood, beside the slow curve of the Tiber, its hills holding layers of memory beneath stone and dust. The wider streets he ordered after the fire continued to carry footsteps. Brick and mortar replaced timber in quiet testimony to reform born from disaster. Markets reopened each morning as they had for generations. Bread was baked, water flowed, voices rose and fell in familiar patterns. Empires do not move by emotion alone. They move through systems, through roads, laws, legions, and grain ships crossing open sea. Nero's reign, with all its brilliance and fracture, became one chapter within a much longer story. Some remembered him as tyrant, some remembered him as benefactor, some remembered the music, others remembered the fear. History rarely grants a single face to those who rule. As night settles over the ancient city in your imagination, the marble cools, torches dim. The noise of the forum softens into distant echoes. Somewhere in the vast sprawl of Rome, a child sleeps unaware of politics, unaware of dynasties rising and falling, aware only of tomorrow's sunlight. That is how history continues, quietly, steadily, beyond the reach of any one name. Nero lived intensely. He built, performed, feared, desired, commanded, and finally stood alone. Yet the world did not close with him. It shifted, adjusted, endured. And now, as we step away from first-century Rome, let the streets grow quiet in your mind. Let the echoes fade. Let the long arc of history feel steady rather than sudden. The empire moves on,